The fire took the oak shelving faster than Eugenia Calloway could draw breath. Smoke rolled along the library ceiling at Hartcombe Grange, swallowing sheet after sheet of the ledgers she had stayed awake through the worst of the winter to build. Beyond the window, somewhere out in the dark of the drive, she could hear the hoofbeats of men bringing an order from a court of law, and she understood that whether the fire was put out or not, she would not sleep beneath this roof again tonight. 9 months earlier, she had stood before the altar rail of St. George's, Hanover Square, laced into a gown of white satin stiff enough to stand on its own, certain that the worst thing that could happen to a woman was to be humiliated before 300 guests. She had been wrong. The man who had walked a mistress down that aisle had never truly wanted to marry her at all. He had wanted something else entirely, something that only one particular person, saying one particular word before a jury of strangers, could hand into his keeping. In the smoke, a man's hand plunged into the flames and dragged out an iron box that might be the only thing left to save her, or might bury her for good, depending entirely on who read what was inside it first. His cry of pain was lost beneath the crack of splitting wood. By morning, an order bearing the seal of the court of Saintry would be placed in her hands, declaring that her own mind, not her land, not her fortune, not her name, would be weighed before a jury and a gallery of strangers who had paid nothing for the privilege of watching. The question was not whether she would live to see the sun rise over the hills of Gloucestershire again. The question was which of the people she had trusted had laid the first stone of this trial long before any fire had ever been lit. It began, as such ruin so often does, on what was meant to be the finest morning of her life. The 18th of September, 1838, dawned pale and mild over Mayfair, and by 10 o'clock the pews of St. George's, Hanover Square, held 300 of the most fashionable people in London, arranged along the aisle like porcelain set out for display, all of them holding their breath in the particular silence that only very expensive people can make when nobody dares to move. Late summer light came slanting through the tall windows in long gold bars, catching on the powder in someone's hair, on the polished buttons of a footman's livery, on the great mass of white lilies banked along the chancel rail, until the whole church smelled faintly of a funeral got up in wedding clothes, though nobody present would have said so aloud. Eugenia Calloway stood at the altar steps in her mother's lace and her own resolve, holding to the same cold, practical reasoning that had carried her through 6 months of preparation. Marriage at her father's table had never once been discussed as a matter of the heart. It was an arrangement, plain and useful, of the kind her father had spent half a year negotiating as carefully as any bill before Parliament. She brought a spotless lineage and a desperate need of capital. Julian Thorncastle, Duke of Calderbrook, brought an ancient title and a fortune large enough to make her father's debts vanish, as though they had never existed. By the arithmetic of her class, it was a fair trade, and she had accepted it the way a soldier accepts an order she has not been permitted to question. There had been a time when Eugenia was younger, when the Calloway name still meant something more than a set of debts waiting to be called in. Her grandfather had left the estate in good order. Her father had spent the better part of 20 years undoing that work, one card table and one bad investment at a time, until the barony that had once held land in 3 counties now held, in any meaningful sense, only the house in Grosvenor Street and the growing dread of what the next post might bring. She did not love him. She had met him perhaps a dozen times in the course of the courtship, and each time had come away with the same impression of a man who wore his charm the way other men wore a good coat, put on for company, and shed the moment he believed himself unwatched. She had been raised to be useful rather than adored, and she had made her peace with that a long time ago. She was 23 years old, and she had learned young that peace of that kind was the only sort generally on offer to women of her station. She had met him for the first time the previous winter, at a supper given by her aunt, and she remembered still how effortlessly he had drawn the whole table into laughter with a story about a horse race gone wrong, how he had turned to her afterward with an attention so complete that she had for perhaps a quarter of an hour allowed herself to imagine that the arrangement her father was quietly negotiating might not be entirely without warmth. He had sent flowers the following week. He had remembered, at their second meeting, a small remark she had made about a book she was reading, and had brought her a copy of its sequel, as though it cost him nothing at all to notice such things. It was only much later, turning the courtship over in her mind as she stood waiting for him at the altar rail, that she would come to wonder how much of that noticing had been genuine, and how much had been the particular attentiveness of a man who had learned, long before he ever met her, precisely what a frightened young woman in her position most wished to be told. She thought, too, of the single occasion on which she had seen something other than charm cross his face, a fortnight before the wedding, when she had asked him, half in jest, what he meant to do with her once the ceremony was behind them, and he had looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not then name, assessing rather than adoring, before the charm slid back into place, and he told her, smiling, that he meant to make her the envy of every woman in England. She had laughed at the time. She did not feel much like laughing now. The church smelled of white lilies and melted wax. Behind her, somewhere near the back, a clock ticked through a silence that had already gone on 20 minutes longer than it ought. Beside her at the altar rail, the clergyman had begun, for the third or fourth time now, a small, apologetic clearing of his throat, the sort of sound a man makes when he does not know what else to do with an awkward silence. Somewhere behind her she could hear her father's breathing, quick and shallow, and the low, urgent murmur of her aunt attempting to soothe him. Further back still, she caught fragments of a whispered conversation between two women she did not know, something about whether it was quite decent for a duke to keep anyone waiting on his own wedding day, whatever the traffic, and whether perhaps something had happened to him on the road. Her spine had gone rigid beneath her stays, and she made herself breathe slowly, in and out, the way her old governess had once taught her to do before difficult interviews. Near the front, in the second pew on the groom's side, sat a thin, precise man in dark clothes whom she did not recognize, his hands folded over a leather case in his lap as though he expected, at any moment, to be called upon to produce something from it. She noticed him only because he alone in the whole restless church seemed entirely calm, watching the empty aisle with the patient attention of a man waiting for a delivery he was quite certain would arrive. Then the great doors at the rear of the nave groaned open, and every murmur in the building died at once. Eugenia turned, expecting to see her bridegroom flushed and full of apology. Instead, she saw him walking down the center of the aisle with a woman on his arm, who was neither his mother nor his sister. Society knew Odile Marchant well enough. She was an actress of modest talent and considerable beauty, and for some while she had lived in a house in Mayfair that Julian paid for, wearing jewels that Julian had chosen for her with his own hand. A discreet mistress was, among men of her father's rank, an unremarkable fact of life, tucked away and never spoken of over dinner. Bringing her to the wedding, dressed in a gown of deep plum velvet that made every pale satin bodice in the church look like an apology by comparison, was not discretion. It was a message, delivered at once to 300 witnesses. Eugenia felt the whole church turn its attention upon her, at once, 300 pairs of eyes swinging from the aisle to her face, and back again, waiting. She understood with a kind of distant clarity, to see which of them would break first, herself or the silence. Julian's face wore an expression of perfect, well-rehearsed calm. He was not flustered. He did not hurry his step. He walked as a man walks into a room he already owns, and owns without dispute. Behind her, Eugenia heard her father half rise from the front pew, only to be forced back down by his brother's hand upon his shoulder. The guests sat frozen in their seats, unwilling to miss a single instant of what was unfolding before them. At the foot of the altar steps, Julian released Odile's arm with a small, courteous pat, and Odile stepped back to take her place in the front row, as though she had every right to stand there among the family. Julian climbed the 3 steps alone and came to stand beside his bride, smelling of cigar smoke and of a cologne applied far too heavily for so early an hour. "Forgive the hour, Archbishop," he said, pitching his voice to reach the furthest pew without effort. "A tangle of carts on the Strand held me longer than I care to admit." He turned to Eugenia and offered his arm, plainly expecting her to take it, to lower her eyes, to swallow whatever she felt, and allow the ceremony to continue exactly as planned. He knew her father was ruined. He knew she had nowhere else in the world to go. He was counting on the iron cage of what was proper, and only that to finish the work for him. Eugenia looked at his offered sleeve. A thread of gold along the cuff caught the candlelight and threw it back at her. "Julian," she said. Her voice did not rise, but in the hush of the church it landed like a stone dropped into still water. "Yes," he said, the warmth in his voice thinning by the second. "Something troubling you, my dear." "I am perfectly well," Eugenia said. "You have brought your mistress to our wedding." She did not whisper it. She spoke the way she might have ordered tea, plainly, and without any particular heat, and the words carried to every corner of the building. A gasp traveled the length of the pews. An elderly woman near the front clutched at her own collar as though it had suddenly come loose. Julian's composure cracked for exactly as long as it takes a man to blink. "Lower your voice," he murmured, bending close enough that the words reached no one else. "This is neither the place nor the hour for a quarrel." "I have not forgotten what we agreed," Eugenia said, her tone unchanged. "My silence, in exchange for your money settling my father's affairs. You have just spent your half of that bargain, publicly, in front of every witness either of us thought to invite." He straightened, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped low enough that it might almost have passed, to the pews further back, for tenderness. "You forget yourself," he said. "I have made you a duchess this morning, whatever else you imagine has happened. That alone ought to buy a great deal of forgiveness." "I have not asked to be bought," Eugenia said. "I have asked to be respected, and you have shown me, in front of every witness either of us could have wished for, precisely how little of that I am ever to expect from you." "This is exactly the sort of hysterical display I would expect from a bride suddenly overcome with nerves," he said. "Compose yourself and speak your vows, and we shall settle the remainder of this between ourselves, away from all these eyes." The word hysterical landed on her like a slap, though she did not permit her face to show it. She looked past him, first to Odile, whose smile had gone thin and watchful, then to her own father, whose eyes were begging her silently to endure one more hour so that he might keep the roof over his family's head. A great cold weariness settled into her then, deeper than anger. This, she understood in that instant, was to be the whole shape of her married life laid out in miniature before her. A lifetime of this man, testing how far he might push her in front of an audience, simply because he could, and because no one in that church would ever think to stop him. "No," she said. She reached up and worked the comb free from where it anchored the veil to her hair, indifferent to the sting as it tugged loose a few pins along with it, and let the whole length of fine netting slide from her head and settle in a pale heap at her feet, already forgotten before it had finished falling. "Your money no longer holds the appeal it once did, Your Grace," she said. She turned on her heel. Behind her, Julian's voice cracked out, sharp with a shock that was, for once, entirely genuine. "Eugenia, take one more step and there is no mending this, not ever. Then we finally agree on something," she said, without breaking her stride. She walked the length of the nave alone, her train whispering against the stone, and the guests drew back into their pews as she passed, as though she carried some manner of contagion they had no wish to catch. She did not look at Odile Marchant. She did not look at her father. She pushed through the great oak doors into the pale London morning, stood for a single moment on the church steps, and drew an air that tasted of coal smoke and, unmistakably, of something very close to freedom. A small crowd of the idly curious had gathered along the pavement, drawn by nothing more than the sight of so many fine carriages assembled outside so grand a church, and they watched her come down the steps alone in her wedding dress, with an interest that would, she did not doubt, be repeated over supper tables across London before the day was out. She did not hurry. She had given the ton one performance that morning. She saw no reason to give them a second. The carriage ride back to Grosvenor Street was not the dignified silence she had hoped for. Her father sat opposite her, his face gone a mottled purple, striking his cane against the floor of the carriage with nearly every word. "You have ruined us," Lord Raxford said. "This need not have gone further than a season's gossip, forgotten by Christmas. Instead, you have handed every drawing-room in London a story they will still be telling their grandchildren." "He humiliated us both, father," Eugenia said. "He brought his mistress to the altar, and called me hysterical before an archbishop. He is a duke, her father said, as though this settled every question that could ever reasonably be raised. Do you imagine your own mother enjoyed my indiscretions in our first years together? She had the good sense to look the other way, and we managed well enough. And now what remains to us? Ruinous debt, Eugenia. Debt I have no earthly way of meeting. Do you know what I owe at White's alone? He said, his voice cracking now with something closer to genuine fear than fury. Do you have any notion what a man in my position is made to feel sitting at that table night after night, smiling, while every soul in the room knows precisely how thin the ice beneath him has grown? I know precisely what you owe, father, Eugenia said. I have known it for some months, though you never once thought to tell me yourself. Sell the property in Kent, she said flatly. It has stood in this family above 200 years. Then let it go to whoever will have it, and be glad of the offer, she said, and turned to face him properly, for the first time since they had entered the carriage, her eyes giving him nothing. I will not spend the rest of my days married to a man who enjoys humiliating me in front of an audience, simply because he can, merely so that a house in Kent might keep its name over the door a little longer. You raised me to be a wife, father, not a sacrifice, and I find I have grown rather attached to the distinction. He said nothing further to that. He only looked for a moment less like a wronged patriarch and more like a frightened old man who had wagered away every safe thing he had ever owned, and Eugenia felt something twist in her chest, half pity and half a fury she had no name for. Before she made herself turn her face to the window instead, and watch London slide past, gray and indifferent to all of it. It was only that evening, once she was home, and had wrung hard for Suki to come and unlace her out of the ruined gown, that she began to understand the fuller shape of what her father had done in the months of the marriage negotiations. Get this off me, Eugenia said, and Suki, a girl of perhaps 20, with steady hands despite her own evident fright, set to work on the long row of hooks at her back without a word of complaint. Suki had come into her service only the previous year, recommended by the housekeeper as a girl who could be trusted to keep her opinions to herself. And in the whole of that year, Eugenia had rarely had occasion to test whether the recommendation was accurate. She suspected she was about to find out. When the corset was finally loosened, Eugenia drew a deep, aching breath and stood for a moment, simply feeling the return of her own lungs to her. Her Aunt Frances called at 7, uninvited, already dressed for the opera, as though the day held nothing more serious in it than an inconvenient change of plans, and sat with Eugenia for the better part of an hour, offering a great many soft, useless remarks about how these things generally blew over given time enough, and how a woman of good family always found her feet again eventually, provided she did not do anything rash in the meanwhile to make matters worse. Eugenia listened and thanked her, and said nothing at all about Gloucestershire. Once her aunt had gone, she sent Suki down for tea, and, left alone, went looking through her late mother's old writing desk for a particular letter she remembered, something warm and ordinary that she thought might steady her. She did not find the letter. She found instead, tucked among a stack of her father's own papers that he had left carelessly upon the desk in his fury, that morning, a copy of a deed, several pages in length, dense with legal language she could not entirely follow, bearing her father's signature at the foot of the last page, and a date some 5 months old. The paper was heavier than an ordinary letter, the kind used for documents meant to be kept rather than burned, and a red wax seal, cracked now where the pages had been folded and refolded, showed the impression of a crest she did not immediately recognize, though something in its shape nagged at her. She had not meant to read it, but her own name appeared twice upon the first page, and once her eye had caught upon it, she found she could not make herself look away. She read it through twice by the light of a single candle, and understood perhaps one sentence in 4, the rest buried beneath a thicket of whereas, and heretofore, and party of the first part that seemed designed less to explain anything than to discourage anyone without legal training from trying. But certain phrases surfaced clearly enough from the thicket to trouble her regardless of what surrounded them. Full and free consent in the event of incapacity. Such powers as may reasonably be required. She did not know, sitting alone with the candle guttering low, precisely what powers were being described, nor required for what. She knew only that she did not like the shape the words made when she set them beside each other. As best she could untangle the language, it appeared to be some manner of consent granted by Lord Raxford to solicitors acting on behalf of the Duke of Calderbrook, touching upon certain of her father's outstanding debts, and, more strangely, upon the future management of her own affairs, in the event that her father should, for whatever reason, be found unable to act on her behalf. She remembered now, turning the pages slowly by candlelight, her father remarking once at dinner in the spring, with an odd, grateful softness she had not questioned at the time, that Julian had shown considerable generosity in settling several old obligations of his ahead of the wedding, as a mark of goodwill toward the family he was soon to join. She had thought little of it then. A future son by marriage easing a father's burdens had seemed, if anything, rather in the man's favor. Sitting alone now, with the folded pages in her lap, and the ruin of her wedding gown still pooled upon the floor where Suki had left it, the generosity did not feel like generosity at all. It felt something purchased in advance and paid for in full, though she could not yet say what precisely had been bought. "Suki," she said, when the girl returned with the tea tray, "do you recall a Mr. Praed, the solicitor who came to see my father in the spring?" "I recall him well enough, miss," Suki said. "He came a great many more times than seemed needed for wedding papers, if you will pardon my saying so. Cook remarked upon it more than once below stairs." Eugenia folded the deed back along its original creases and set it aside upon the desk. She did not understand it yet, not fully. But she understood enough, sitting in the wreck of what ought to have been the happiest day of her life, to know that she had no wish to remain within easy reach of either Julian Thorncastle or his solicitor when the fuller understanding finally arrived. By nightfall, the house had settled into a strange, watchful quiet, broken only by the steady arrival of notes, most of them addressed to her father rather than to herself, though a good many found their way to her regardless. She recognized the handwriting on several as belonging to women who had never once troubled to call on her before that morning, their concern arriving now with remarkable speed once there was finally something worth being concerned about. One, from a woman she had once counted almost a friend, hoped in looping, delighted handwriting that dearest Eugenia was bearing up, and wondered, in the same breath, whether it was true that the Marchant woman had worn plum to a wedding, of all the shocking things. Eugenia read it twice, admired the economy with which it managed to combine sympathy and appetite in a single sentence, and fed it to the fire along with the rest. Her father had locked himself in his study and had not come out. Eugenia sat alone by the drawing-room fire and read each note through before feeding it, one by one, to the flames. At midnight, the last and heaviest letter of the day arrived, marked with the Calderbrook crest, pressed into a thick disk of wax at its fold. She slid it open with the edge of a hairpin, having lost patience some hours before with anything resembling ceremony. "Eugenia," it read, "whatever possessed you this morning did you very little credit, though I am willing, for the sake of what remains of this arrangement, to set it down to a young woman's nerves rather than deliberate insult. Send word to my solicitor by the end of the week, and we shall arrange a second date, kept quiet this time, away from the whole of London's notice. Consider your point made and thoroughly received. I would think carefully, however, before deciding it worth what your father stands to lose if you make me wait much longer for your answer. Calderbrook." He believed, she understood, reading the lines a second time by the dying firelight, that she would come crawling back to him, because real ruin was meant to be unthinkable to a woman of her station. He did not understand, or did not trouble himself to care, that she would rather be ruined on terms entirely her own than kept safe on his. She did not trouble herself to answer him. She held the letter to the last of the fire until it caught, and set it on the grate to finish burning on its own, watching the wax bubble and blacken, and the paper itself curl inward, edge first, until nothing legible remained of it at all. She sat for a while longer watching the last of it turn to ash among the coals, thinking not of Julian at all, but of the thin, precise solicitor she had noticed near the front of the church, sitting with his leather case already prepared, as though he had known, long before the doors ever opened, that there would be papers required before the day was through. She could not yet say what those papers might have been meant for. But she found, turning the question over, that she no longer believed it had been mere coincidence. Then she rose and went to the small writing desk in the corner of the room and drew out a slim, leather-bound ledger she had not opened. In some years, a private record her mother had once kept of her own affairs before her death. Most of what her father had once controlled through her mother's dowry had long since been spent or wagered away at cards. But there remained, according to the ledger's final pages, a single small property that had never come into his hands at all, called Hartcombe Grange, a manor of some description standing somewhere in the Gloucestershire hills, left to Eugenia by some private arrangement of her mother's that she had never before troubled herself to examine closely. She had always assumed, on the rare occasions she thought of it at all, that it was simply an oversight in the general settling of the estate. Now, with the memory of her father's strange deed still cold in her mind, she found herself wondering whether it might be something else entirely. It produced no income that she was aware of. It had stood empty for the better part of a decade, by the ledger's own account. But it was stone and land that no man alive, neither her father nor Julian Thorncastle, could touch by any right the law recognized. She rang the bell. Suki appeared a moment later, looking thoroughly exhausted and not a little frightened by the events of so long a day. "Suki," Eugenia said, "we leave for Gloucestershire at first light. See that a trunk is packed with whatever will hold up to mud and cold rather than admiration. The silk can stay behind and rot in the wardrobe for all I care." She did not sleep that night, or slept only in fits, and toward dawn she went once more to her father's study door and stood outside it for some minutes without knocking, listening to the silence within, before she turned away and went down to see that the trunks were properly loaded. Whatever she had meant to say to him, she found she no longer had the words for it, and perhaps, she thought, climbing into the carriage, as the first gray light came up over the rooftops of Grosvenor Street, that was answer enough in itself. The journey took the better part of 4 days, the carriage jolting over roads that worsened steadily the further west they traveled, the sky settling into a bruised, unbroken gray that never quite gave way to rain and never quite cleared either. Eugenia's bones ached with the cold by the second morning out of London. The provisions they had packed had gone stale by the third. They stopped the first night at Oxford, the second somewhere beyond Burford, where the innkeeper's wife pressed a heel of bread and cheese upon Suki, with more kindness than either of them had been shown by anyone in London in the whole of the preceding week, and the third within sight of the first low hills that Eugenia understood, from her mother's old ledger, to mark the beginning of Gloucestershire proper. Each night's room was small and low-ceilinged, and smelled of tallow and damp plaster, and Eugenia lay awake in each of them, turning over what little she understood of her father's deed, and finding no comfort in any conclusion she was able to reach. On the third night, in a cramped room above a tavern taproom, loud enough that sleep came only in fragments, Suki asked her, in the small, careful voice of someone who has been turning a question over for some time, before daring to ask it, whether they were truly never going back. Eugenia considered the question longer than its simplicity, perhaps warranted, before she answered that she did not know what she would do in a year's time, or even in a month's, but that she knew with complete certainty what she would not do, which was return to Grosvenor Street to wait for Julian Thorncastle to decide he had punished her sufficiently. Suki seemed to find some comfort in the distinction, if not much reassurance in it, and said nothing further on the subject for the remainder of the journey. And yet, with every mile that put London further behind her, she found it grew easier to breathe, as though some hand had been resting upon her chest, since the moment Julian walked through those church doors with another woman on his arm. And only now, jolting west through unfamiliar country, was that hand finally beginning to lift. They arrived at Hartcombe Grange in the last gray light of the fourth evening, in the middle of a downpour that had chosen that precise hour to break at last over the Cotswold Hills. The house rose out of the mist like something half-remembered from an old story, built of dark stone gone rough and green with age, half swallowed by ivy that had plainly not been cut back in a great many years. Several of the upper windows stood boarded over. The great front door looked as though it had not been properly opened since the turn of the century. "Miss," Suki said, peering out through glass streaked thick with rain, her voice gone small, It looks as though nobody has lived here in an age." "Good," Eugenia said, drawing her traveling cloak tighter about her shoulders. "An empty house cannot humiliate me in front of anyone." She stepped down into the mud without waiting for the footman to lower the step properly, the rain finding every gap in her collar within moments and turning the hem of her traveling gown to a sodden weight against her ankles. A man came round from what must once have been the stable block, an older fellow carrying a lantern, his face set in the particular, weathered scowl of someone who did not care for surprises upon his own ground. He looked between the carriage, its crest still faintly visible beneath years of London dust, and Eugenia herself, standing ankle-deep in the mud in a traveling gown far too fine for the weather she had brought it into. "So you're the one come to take the place on, then," he said, his tone offering nothing in the way of welcome. "News finds its way out here eventually, whatever else does not." Josiah fell. "I have kept this house from falling down entirely since your mother's time, such as my keeping has been worth. Then you and I have a great deal of work ahead of us, Mr. Fell," Eugenia said. He looked at her a long moment as though weighing whether she truly meant it, and then he gave a short grunt that she was already beginning to suspect was, from him, as close to agreement as the world was likely to receive, and led the way toward the door. He did not ask why she had come, nor how long she meant to stay, and she was grateful enough for the omission that she did not offer an explanation unasked. Inside, the hall smelled of dust and old rain, and something faintly like rot beneath the floorboards. Sheeted furniture crouched in the gloom like sleeping animals disturbed from a long winter. The cold had a damp, settled quality that seemed to reach directly into the joints of whoever stood too long within it. It was by any reasonable measure available to a gently raised woman of 23, a wretched place to have arrived at, after everything she had lost in the course of a single week. Fell went ahead of her with the lantern and found enough dry wood in an outbuilding to coax a small resentful fire to life in what had once, by the look of the shelves lining 3 of its walls, been the house's library. Eugenia stood in the doorway of that room longer than she meant to, watching the flames throw shifting light across spines, gone soft with damp, and told herself, with more conviction than she entirely felt, that a room full of books could be made to serve a woman quite as well as a room full of guests ever had. Fell, watching her from the doorway with the lantern still in hand, said, not unkindly for a man of so few words, that there was a bedroom on the first floor with a roof sound enough to keep the worst of the weather out, and that his own wife, before her death some years past, had always said the view from its window was the finest thing about the whole sorry pile of stone. Eugenia thanked him and said she would see it in the morning, when there might be enough light to judge a view by anything other than imagination. For tonight, she said, the fire would do very well. It was, Eugenia thought, standing in the doorway with rainwater, still running from the hem of her cloak onto the stone floor, very nearly exactly what she needed. For the first time since she had stood at the altar of St. George's and let her veil fall to the marble, she felt something that was not quite hope. Not yet. But it was, she thought, watching Fell set his lantern upon a dust-sheeted table and turn to look at her as though waiting for orders, at least the beginning of one. Winter came down over the valley in earnest within a fortnight of their arrival, and with it came the particular unglamorous labor of making a half-ruined house fit to be lived in through the cold months ahead. Eugenia rose each morning before the sun properly cleared the eastern ridge, dressed in whatever of her old gowns Suki judged least likely to be ruined further by the day's work, and set about learning, by trial and a good deal of error, how a house was actually kept running when there was no housekeeper, no cook, and no income to speak of, beyond what remained in her purse after the journey west. Fell showed her how to lay a fire that would not smoke the room black within the hour. Suki, whose own mother had once kept house for a curate's family, taught her the rudiments of a stew that could be stretched across 3 days without anyone starving on the 4th. Eugenia's hands, which had spent 23 years being admired for their softness, blistered within a week, and had gone rough and capable within a month, and she found she did not miss the softness nearly so much as she had expected to. Word of who exactly had come to occupy the old ruin above the valley spread through the nearest villages within days of her arrival, carried, she supposed, by whichever tradesman had first been sent for provisions, and by the second week she had grown accustomed to the particular quality of attention that followed her into any shop or market stall she entered. Half curiosity and half a kind of wary respect, as though the county could not quite decide whether she was a scandal to be avoided or a novelty to be studied at close range. She found on the whole that she preferred it to the flattery she had left behind in London. A shopkeeper who watched her with open curiosity, at least, was not pretending to feel anything he did not. The upper windows were the first order of business, since a house that let in the weather could not be made to hold heat, no matter how carefully the fires were tended. Fell knew a carpenter in the nearest market town, willing to work for coin, and a promise of more once the estate had funds enough to pay him properly, and Eugenia, going through what remained of her jewelry by candlelight, one evening in late October, settled upon a pearl and garnet bracelet, a gift from her father upon her presentation at court, and purchased, she strongly suspected, upon credit he had never troubled to repay, as the piece she could most easily part with. She rode into Cirencester herself rather than sending Fell, partly because she did not yet entirely trust anyone else to negotiate on her behalf, and partly because she found, to her own mild surprise, that she wished to see for herself what a piece of jewelry she had once worn, without a second thought, might actually be worth in coin. The jeweler offered £40. Eugenia, who had spent the whole of the ride rehearsing precisely this conversation, informed him that the stones alone were worth more than that before he had so much as examined the setting properly, and left, some 3/4 of an hour later, with £60 in her reticule and a grudging sort of respect in the jeweler's manner that she found she liked considerably better than the flattery she had grown used to in London drawing rooms. The £60 paid the carpenter, bought coal enough to see them through the worst of the cold, and left a little over for provisions, which Eugenia recorded, to the shilling, in a fresh ledger she had begun the very week of her arrival, modeled on the one her mother had kept. She had not expected to find any particular satisfaction in columns of figures. She found instead that there was something almost soothing in it, a kind of order she could build entirely by her own hand, answerable to no one, dependent on no man's goodwill or temper. Some evenings, when the figures balanced better than she had feared, and there was a little left over after the week's necessities, she allowed herself the private, almost guilty satisfaction of believing that her father, for all his faults, might at least have recognized in her the same instinct for arithmetic that had, in some earlier and more disciplined version of himself, once kept the Raxford estates solvent for 2 generations before his own habits undid them. It was not a comfortable thought. She found she returned to it anyway, more often than she cared to admit. It was in the second week of November, with the worst of the necessary repairs behind them, and the house at least habitable, if not yet handsome, that word first reached her of Nathaniel Hargrove. She had written, some fortnight earlier, to every mill she could learn the name of within a day's ride, inquiring whether any among them might be interested in securing a contract for the coming spring's wool, sight unseen, at a fair price agreed now, rather than haggled over later when the fleece was already cut and spoiling. Most did not trouble to reply. One replied with an offer so low it read almost as an insult. The third letter she received, some 10 days after she had sent her own, was short, unadorned, and asked only how many head of sheep the flock presently numbered, how long it had been since they were last properly sheared, and whether the lady in question meant to be present herself when the work was done, or intended to leave it to an agent, as most gentlewomen of her acquaintance generally did. It was signed, without any flourish whatsoever, N. Hargrove. She replied that the flock numbered somewhere near 400 head, feral and uncounted, for the better part of a decade, and that she intended to be present for every hour of the shearing herself, agent or no agent, as she had found in recent months that very little of value got done in her absence. He came to see her himself within the fortnight, riding up the drive on a solid, unremarkable horse, and dismounting before a house that plainly gave him some pause, judging by the length of time he spent looking up at the boarded windows before he so much as knocked. Fell showed him into what passed, that winter, for a drawing room, a chamber with a fire lit, and most of its furniture uncovered, though the wallpaper had gone the color of weak tea with damp and age. Nathaniel Hargrove was not, by the standards of the men Eugenia had been raised to admire, a handsome man in any conventional sense. He was broad through the shoulder in the manner of someone who had not always paid other men to do his lifting for him, his hands roughened in a way that spoke of years spent nearer the looms than the counting house, and he wore a coat of good, dark, durable cloth entirely without the tailoring that would have marked it out in Mayfair. He did not bow when he entered. He gave a short, level nod, as though bowing were a habit he had never seen sufficient reason to acquire, and his eyes went once around the room, taking in the damp wallpaper and the sheeted furniture still stacked in the corner, with the frank, assessing look of a man accustomed to judging the value of a thing at a glance rather than being told what to think of it. "Lady Eugenia," he said, "I received your letter. I am no longer answering to that particular form of address, Mr. Hargrove," Eugenia said. "Eugenia Calloway will do very well." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not immediately read, something between assessment and, she thought, faint amusement, before he inclined his head again and said only, "As you like it." He did not waste time on pleasantries, which she found she was grateful for. He asked pointed questions about the state of the flock, the condition of the land, whether she had men enough to bring 400 sheep down off rough country in good order, and whether she understood that a first shearing after so long a neglect was likely to produce fleece in poorer condition than she perhaps imagined. She answered each question as plainly as it was asked, admitted where she did not yet know the answer, and asked in turn precisely what price he was prepared to commit to now, in writing, rather than leave to the mercy of the spring market. "People in this valley talk," he said, when the practical questions had been exhausted. "A duke's jilted bride does not often turn up counting sheep by lantern light within a day's ride of my mill, and I found I did not entirely trust an agent to give me an honest account of whether the story was worth the wool attached to it. You have ridden a considerable distance, Mr. Hargrove, to satisfy a curiosity about wool that could have been settled by letter," Eugenia said. He almost smiled at that, an expression that sat oddly on a face, otherwise set in permanent, weathered seriousness. "I will offer you 5 pence a pound," he said, "sight unseen on the flock as you have described it, with the price to be adjusted only if the fleece proves considerably worse than expected, once it is actually on the scales." "That is an insult dressed up as an opening offer," Eugenia said. "My grandfather ran this land before it was left to rot, and Cotswold wool has never once needed apologizing for. 9 pence, and I will guarantee the fleece is sorted and cleaned of the worst debris before it ever reaches your cart, which will save your people hours at the carding machines that you are presently paying wages for regardless." He raised an eyebrow, and this time the amusement was plain enough that he did not trouble to hide it. "7, he said. 8.5, she countered, "and you provide the carts." They settled, after a further quarter of an hour of argument conducted with a bluntness Eugenia found considerably more restful than any drawing-room negotiation she had ever been party to, on 8 pence the pound, carts provided, terms to be set down in writing before either of them left the room. When it was done, he sat back in his chair and regarded her with something that was no longer quite amusement. "For a woman raised to embroider and pour tea, Miss Calloway, you drive a harder bargain than most factors I deal with," he said. "Nobody troubled to teach me embroidery with any real conviction, Mr. Hargrove," Eugenia said, "but I will take your meaning as the compliment I believe you intended it to be." He invited her, before he left that first afternoon, to see the mill for herself before the spring, so that she might understand precisely where her wool would end its journey and satisfy herself. He was not the sort of man who let good fleece rot in a damp storeroom for want of proper handling. She rode down to Stroud the following week, with Fell driving the cart and Sukey along for propriety's sake, and found Hargrove's mill to be a great brick-built structure crouched along the bank of the Stroudwater Canal, its wheel turning steadily despite the cold, the whole building shuddering with the rhythmic clatter of looms she could feel through the soles of her boots long before she was properly inside the door. He showed her through it himself, rather than leaving the task to a foreman, walking her past rows of women, working the carding frames, and up a narrow iron stair to a small windowed room built into the rafters, positioned so that a single glance through its panes took in nearly the whole length of the floor below. He spoke of his workers with a bluntness she had not expected from a man of his trade, telling her plainly that he paid wages in coin rather than in goods, as the new law required, and as a good many mill owners in the valley still quietly did not, and that he had no patience for a man who tried to cheat his own hands out of an honest day's pay merely because the law was slow to catch him at it. "You run this like a man who intends to still be running it in 20 years, Eugenia observed, watching the looms below through the glass. "I intend to still be running it in 40, Hargrove said. "I did not rebuild what my father lost so that I could lose it again through carelessness." He showed her, too, the ledger room adjoining his office, where a clerk kept careful record of every bale received and every length of finished cloth dispatched, and remarked, almost as an aside, that he trusted figures a great deal more than he trusted a man's word alone, since figures, properly kept, could not flatter a person the way a tongue so easily could. Eugenia found herself thinking, on the ride back to Hartcombe Grange that evening, that she had heard a version of that same sentiment from her own mother's ledger, in its own quiet way, every night she had sat working through its faded columns by candlelight, and that she had perhaps found, in a mill owner with rough hands and no patience for flattery, someone who understood her rather better, on that single point, than any gentleman she had ever been presented to in a London drawing-room. She left that day with a fair notion of exactly what her wool would become once it left her land, and a growing reluctant respect for a man who seemed entirely uninterested in whether she found him respectable, so long as she found him reliable. He came again before Christmas, ostensibly to confirm the carting arrangements for the spring, and stayed the better part of an hour discussing matters that had very little to do with wool. He asked her bluntly why a woman of her birth had chosen a ruin in Gloucestershire, over whatever comfortable arrangement might still have been salvaged from the wreck of her engagement, and she found herself telling him, in rather more detail than she had intended, about the church and the veil, and the particular patronizing note Julian had sent that same night promising to overlook her fit of nerves. Hargrove listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and when she had finished, he said only that he was not surprised a duke should imagine himself owed forgiveness for humiliating a woman in front of 300 witnesses, since in his experience men of that class rarely imagined they owed anyone anything at all. "You speak of that class as though you have particular cause to distrust it," Eugenia observed. He was quiet long enough that she thought he did not mean to answer. Then he said, "My father kept a mill of his own once, a smaller concern than the one I run now, some 30 miles from here. When I was 20 years old, the old Duke of Calderbrook, this one's father, called in every note my father had ever signed within the space of a single fortnight, over some slight my father had never fully understood, and my family lost everything we had inside a season. My father did not live to see me build anything back. I have spent every year since watching that family the way another man might watch weather he has once been caught out in, always half expecting it to turn again without warning." Eugenia sat with that for a long moment, the fire cracking softly in the grate. "So when you learned that the runaway bride in question had been jilted by that particular family," she said slowly, "you did not come out here only from curiosity." "No," he admitted, "I did not." She found oddly that she was not offended by the admission. If anything, it steadied something in her, the knowledge that his willingness to deal fairly with her was not built on chivalry alone, which she had learned young to distrust, but on a grievance of his own, specific and long held, that made his interest in her survival considerably more durable than mere gallantry was ever likely to prove. "Then we are allies for reasons neither of us need apologize for," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that had for once nothing calculating in it at all. "I believe we are," he said. She thought about that conversation a great deal in the weeks that followed, turning it over the way she had learned to turn over everything that winter. It occurred to her, lying awake one night with the wind working at the shutters, that she had spent the whole of her life among men who wanted things from her family's name and very little from her, while Hargrove wanted nothing whatsoever from the name, only, it seemed, a fair price honestly arrived at, and an old debt eventually repaid in whatever coin the world allowed him. She found she trusted that sort of wanting rather more than she had ever trusted its opposite. The weeks between Christmas and the turn of the year brought a letter from her father, the first she had received since leaving London, written in a hand considerably less steady than his usual firm script. He wrote that Calderbrook's people had been quietly purchasing up several of his older promissory notes, small ones, scattered across half a dozen tradesmen and moneylenders who had been glad enough to sell the debt on to someone who could actually be relied upon to settle it eventually, and that he did not much like what it suggested about the Duke's patience or the lack of it. He did not ask her to return. He did not for once blame her outright for any of it. He asked only whether she was keeping warm, and whether the Gloucestershire air agreed with her better than London's had, in a tone so unlike his usual bluster that Eugenia read the letter twice before she folded it away, uncertain whether what she felt was pity or a fresh species of dread. She showed the letter to Tukes when he next called, in the second week of January, a visit she had written to request some weeks before, once she had finally worked up the resolve to ask him directly about the deed she had found among her father's papers on the night of the wedding. Ambrose Tukes had been her mother's solicitor before he was ever her father's, a small, precise man well into his 50s, with ink permanently ground into the creases of his right hand, and he had known Eugenia since she was in short skirts. He read the copy of the deed she showed him in complete silence, twice through, his frown deepening with each pass, before he set it down upon the table between them. "This is not, strictly speaking, illegal," he said carefully. "Your father had every right to sign whatever he pleased regarding his own debts. But the language here, touching upon the future management of your affairs, is considerably broader than anything a reasonable solicitor ought to have allowed a client to agree to without explaining its full weight to him first." "I do not think your father understood what he was signing, Eugenia. I think Mr. Praed made rather sure of that." "Then what was it for?" Eugenia asked. What could Julian possibly want with a document like that, when he fully expected to marry me within the month regardless? Tukes folded his hands upon the table and regarded her over the top of his spectacles with the particular gravity she remembered from her childhood, the same look he had once worn, explaining to her, at 9 years old, why her mother's canary could not simply be revived by wishing hard enough. Men of Calderbrook's sort do not generally trouble themselves to prepare documents they have no intention of using, he said. Whether he meant to use it that morning at the altar, or 6 months hence, or never at all, unless some particular circumstance made it convenient, I cannot say with the papers I presently hold. But I have practiced law in this county for above 30 years, my dear, and I have learned that a man who takes the trouble to have such language drafted, and witnessed, and safely filed away, is a man who has already imagined the day he might need it. Tukes was quiet for a long moment, turning the pages over once more. "I do not know yet," he said finally, "but I do not like the shape it makes, sitting beside everything else that has happened since. I would ask you to be careful, my dear, and to keep that copy somewhere safer than a desk drawer." He did not stay the night, though she pressed him to, citing business that could not wait in Gloucester. But before he left, he told her, almost as an afterthought, that her mother had left a good deal more behind her than a single small manor and a private ledger, and that there were papers concerning a settlement made at the time of her parents' marriage, that Eugenia might, when she had a quiet hour to spare, wish to ask him about properly. She was too occupied that winter with coal and carpenters, and the slow, grinding work of keeping a household solvent, to press him further on it that evening, and he did not raise it again before he rode away into the frost, and so the matter sat, half examined, at the back of her mind through the remainder of that long, cold season, waiting for a spring she did not yet know would arrive with a good deal more urgency attached to it than she presently imagined. By the middle of February, the worst of the frost had begun, at last, to loosen its grip on the valley, and the first green showed itself along the hedgerows in the lane, leading down toward the old wharf at the edge of the estate, a stone landing her grandfather had once used, according to her mother's ledger, for shipping timber down to the canal before the family's fortunes had turned. Suki had grown over the course of that long winter from a frightened girl into something closer to a companion than a servant, though neither of them ever remarked upon the change directly, and it was Suki who first suggested, one bright, thawing afternoon, that Eugenia might do worse than walk down to see the old landing for herself, rather than leaving its condition to Fell's account of it alone. Eugenia found, laughing properly for what felt like the first time in months at the plain good sense of the suggestion, that she agreed at once, and the two of them set out together along the lane, boots sinking into half-frozen mud, talking of nothing in particular beyond the ordinary small business of the household, in a manner that felt, for the length of that single afternoon, very much like the friendship it had quietly become. Fell walked her down to see the wharf itself one gray thawing afternoon, the stones slick with moss and half sunk into the bank, and told her in his usual sparing way that it had not been used in his own lifetime, but that the transit right attached to it, so far as he understood, had never been formally surrendered. Eugenia stood looking at the water a long while, turning that piece of information over the way she had learned, that winter, to turn over every scrap of fact that came her way, weighing it for whatever use it might someday be worth. She did not yet know what use, if any, an old and half-forgotten wharf might have to a woman whose only business at present was wool. But she had learned, in the months since a church door had groaned open on the worst morning of her life, that the things which seemed to matter least at the time one found them were very often the things that mattered most when the reckoning finally came, and so she filed the wharf away, as she filed everything now, alongside the deed, and Tux's warning, and the strange, gnawing feeling that had not left her since January, that somewhere beneath the ordinary business of her days, a slower and more patient sort of danger was still quietly gathering itself. By March the lambs had come, wobbling and improbable, across the high pasture beyond the ruined dovecote, and Fell, watching them from the gate one morning with something almost like satisfaction on his usually shuttered face, remarked that it had been a good many years since Hartcombe land had produced anything worth the trouble of counting. Eugenia stood beside him in the cold, bright air, and found that she agreed with him, and that for the first time since a veil had fallen to the marble floor of St. George's, she was looking forward, rather than merely enduring, whatever the coming season chose to bring. There was, of course, a great deal still to be done before that season could be trusted to reward her for the looking forward. A flock left feral for the better part of a decade did not come down off rough moorland willingly, and Fell was blunt about the fact that counting sheep and catching sheep were two entirely different arts, the second requiring more men and dogs than the estate presently possessed or could easily afford. Eugenia spent the better part of a week that March writing to every farmer and shepherd within reach of Hartcombe land, offering wages she could only just meet and the promise of a fair season's work to follow if the first shearing went well, and by the last week of the month she had secured, through a mixture of persistence and the sale of two of her mother's small remaining rings, enough hands and enough coin to bring the flock down when the time came. She wrote to Hargrove as well, confirming the arrangement they had settled upon in November, and asking, in a postscript she told herself was purely practical, whether he intended to be present himself when the first wool actually reached his mill, or whether he trusted his agents enough by then to leave the matter to them. His reply arrived within 3 days, shorter even than his letters generally ran, and said only that he made a point of seeing every new supplier's first delivery with his own eyes, and that he did not expect hers to be an exception. By the last week of April, the high pasture had gone properly green, and the men Eugenia had hired through the spring, a dozen of them, rough-handed and mostly silent, arrived at Hartcombe Grange before dawn with dogs that knew their business rather better than their masters generally credited them for. Fell had warned her it would not be an elegant business, bringing 400 head of half-wild sheep down off open moorland, and he had not exaggerated. The courtyard, scrubbed and swept through the whole of the previous week in preparation, was transformed within the hour into a churned, bleeding chaos of mud and wool and shouting men, the air thick with the sharp, animal smell of lanolin and dung and nervous sweat. She had spent the preceding fortnight learning, from a shepherd Fell trusted enough to recommend, how a fleece ought properly to be judged, which parts of the wool carried the finest staple and which ought to be sorted away for coarser use, and she found, watching the first fleeces come off the shears that morning, that she could tell good work from careless work almost at a glance, a small private competence that pleased her rather more than she was willing to admit aloud to anyone. Eugenia did not watch from the window. She had told Fell when he suggested it might be more fitting for a lady of her station to oversee the proceedings from indoors, that she had given up being a lady of her station somewhere on the road between London and Oxford the previous September, and she meant it. She stood in the thick of the courtyard from first light, her oldest riding habit already ruined beyond saving. By the second hour, a clipboard borrowed from Fell's own meager stock of estate papers held against her hip, counting fleeces as the shearers threw them, one after another, onto the weighing scales set up along the eastern wall. It was exhausting, filthy, deafening work, and she found she did not mind it in the least. Somewhere past midday, a yearling that had bolted clear of the pen wedged itself, panicking, into a tangle of bramble along the low stone wall, and two of the younger men stood arguing over how best to free it without either of them coming away badly scratched. Eugenia set down her clipboard, waded into the thorns herself, with her sleeves already ruined beyond saving, and worked the animal loose by main force and patience together, emerging some minutes later with her forearms scored red and her hair come half undone from its pins. The courtyard went for one long moment entirely quiet, every man within sight pausing in his work to see whether the lady of the house would retreat indoors to have the scratches tended, as she suspected more than one of them privately expected her to. She did not. She picked her clipboard back up, resumed her count without comment on the state of her arms, and the men, after a beat of startled silence, returned to their own work with what she would later swear was a fraction more willingness in it than they had shown before. She had, without quite meaning to, passed some manner of test she had not known she was sitting for. Hargrove arrived a little after 3 in the afternoon, having ridden up from Stroud once word reached him that the shearing had begun in earnest, and found her standing in the middle of the courtyard, mud dried to a crust along one side of her face, directing the loading of the first properly sorted bales onto his waiting carts with an authority that seemed to surprise even her. "You look," he observed, dismounting, "as though you have been dragged the length of the valley behind a cart." "I have been shearing sheep since before dawn, Mr. Hargrove," Eugenia said, without looking up from her tally. "I did not have leisure to consider my appearance." He examined the bales himself, running the wool between his fingers, with the practiced attention of a man who had judged fleece his whole working life, and pronounced it, after a slow circuit of the yard, considerably better sorted than he generally saw from farms 3 times the size of hers. He paid, on the spot, in coin rather than in promises, and the sum, once she had totted it against the wages owed the shearers, left the estate with a genuine profit for the first time in a decade by anything her mother's old ledger could show her. It was, measured against the fortunes still spent nightly at the card tables of London, a modest sum. To Eugenia, standing in the mud with the coin heavy in her apron pocket, it felt very nearly like an empire. Fell moved among the men through that long afternoon with an ease she had not seen in him before, directing the sorting and the loading with the quiet authority of someone who had, after all, kept some scrap of this land alive through years when nobody had asked him to, and Eugenia found herself watching him a moment longer than the work strictly required, wondering, not for the first time, what exactly the man's story was, and whether the sullenness she had taken for mere unfriendliness upon her arrival had always concealed something rather more complicated beneath it. She remembered, from that first rain-soaked evening, his mention of a wife now some years dead, and the particular gentleness that had crept briefly into his voice, describing the view from the upstairs window she had still, even now, never properly looked out of by daylight. It occurred to her that she knew almost nothing of the man beyond his usefulness to her, and that this was, perhaps, a fault she ought to have remedied a good deal sooner than she had. When the last cart had finally rolled away down the drive toward Stroud, Hargrove lingered in the yard while his own men saw to the horses, and stood beside her looking out over the emptied courtyard, the mud already beginning to dry pale at its edges in the late sun. "You did not need me here today," he said, after a silence that had gone on rather longer than business alone required. Fell and your shepherd could have managed the counting between them. I am aware of that, Mr. Hargrove, Eugenia said. Then why did you write to tell me the date so precisely, if not for the counting? He asked, and there was something in his voice, beneath the usual bluntness, that she had not heard from him before. She considered several answers, all of them more careful than the truth, before she settled, somewhat to her own surprise, upon honesty instead. Because I found I wished you to see it, she said. The whole of it, not merely the ledger afterward. He looked at her for a long moment in the fading light, and something in his weathered, unhandsome face eased into an expression she had no ready name for. Then I am glad I came, he said, and mounted his horse before either of them could say anything further to complicate the moment, leaving her standing alone in the emptied yard, with the coin heavy in her pocket and her heart, quite against her own better judgment, considerably lighter than either fact alone could account for. She paid the shearers their wages that same evening, counting each man's coin into his palm herself rather than leaving the task to Fell, and found, watching them touch their caps to her on the way out through the gate, an unfamiliar and quietly satisfying sort of respect in the gesture, earned not through her father's title, nor through any accident of birth, but through a single long day's honest work properly done and properly paid for. It was, she thought, watching the last of them disappear down the drive into the dusk, a considerably more durable foundation for a person standing than any she had been raised to believe mattered. The letter from her father arrived 4 days later, and the modest triumph of the shearing curdled somewhat in her chest as she read it. Eugenia, it began, without any of his usual preamble. There is no way to soften this, so I shall not attempt it. Calderbrook's agents called upon every creditor who ever held paper against my name within the space of a single week, and bought each debt outright before I so much as understood what was happening. Grosvenor Street must be given up by quarter day. I am writing this from a room above a chandler's shop in Calais, where a man's pride goes a good deal further, on a good deal less than it ever did in London. I will not ask you to forgive what I did to arrange your marriage, nor what my own foolishness has now cost us both. I ask only that you believe I understood, sitting in that carriage the morning after your wedding fell apart, exactly how much of this was already my doing before you ever reached the altar. Raxford. She read it twice through by the window of what had become, that spring, her regular place for correspondence, a small room off the library with better light than anywhere else in the house, and found that the anger she had expected to feel arrived considerably diluted by something closer to grief. Whatever else her father had been, careless and vain, and entirely too fond of the card table, he had at least, in this final letter, stopped pretending that any of it had been anyone's fault but his own. She thought of Kent, briefly, and the 200 years the property had stood in the family before this, and wondered whether it too had already gone to settle some portion of what Julian had called in, or whether her father had at least managed to keep that single scrap of the old name intact before he fled. She did not know, and had no way of finding out that would not cost her a fortnight's waiting for a letter to cross the channel and back, and so she set the question aside, as she had learned to set aside a great many questions that spring, and returned instead to the ledger open upon her desk, where the numbers, at least, gave her back exactly what she put into them, and asked for nothing more. She wondered, too, turning the ledger's pages by the last of the evening light, whether her father had ever once, in all his years at White's, sat at a card table and understood the arithmetic of it half so clearly as she now understood the arithmetic of a flock of sheep. He had spent 20 years believing that fortune favored a bold hand and a confident smile, and had lost, in the end, everything a bold hand and a confident smile could not actually protect. She had spent less than a single year learning that fortune favored, rather more reliably, a careful hand and an honest column of figures, and she found she did not intend to unlearn the lesson merely because it had cost her father so dearly to teach it to her by his own example. She did not have long to sit with the grief before a second, sharper trouble presented itself. It was Suki who noticed it first, in the way of servants who see a great deal more of a household's true workings than their employers generally credit them with. Some 10 days after the shearing, with the wool safely delivered, and the first real coin the estate had produced in years locked away in Eugenia's writing desk, Suki mentioned, in the careful, sideways manner of someone raising a subject. She is not entirely certain she ought to, that Mr. Fell had twice now been seen, down at the Crossroads Inn of an evening, speaking at some length with a stranger who arrived on a good horse, wore town clothes, and did not stay the night anywhere in the village. Eugenia thought of this for exactly as long as it took her to recall the thin, precise solicitor she had noticed at the front of St. George's the previous September, sitting with his leather case already prepared, and something cold settled into her stomach. She said nothing to Fell directly for above a week, watching him instead with the same careful, patient attention she had learned to bring to her mother's old ledgers, cataloging small things she had never before thought to question. The way he always seemed to know, a day or two before she mentioned it to anyone, precisely how much coin the shearing had brought in. The way a letter from Tukes concerning the deed had once gone briefly missing from the hall table before turning up again exactly where it ought to have been, a day later than she remembered leaving it. The way Praed's name, when she had mentioned it once in passing within Fell's hearing, had produced in the older man's face a flicker of something that was not quite surprise. She said nothing of her suspicions to Hargrove either, though she was tempted to, more than once, in the quiet minutes after his letters arrived. It was not, she told herself, a want of trust in him. It was rather that she had grown accustomed, over the course of that long winter, to solving her own troubles at her own pace, and she found she wished to know precisely what she was dealing with before she asked anyone else to help her carry it. She spent one wet evening going through the household accounts she had kept since November, with an eye she had never before turned upon them, and found, once she looked properly, 3 separate occasions on which information she had shared with no one beyond her own household had apparently reached Gloucester within days, information that could only have traveled by way of someone living beneath her own roof. There was no one else it could have been. Suki had been with her since before the wedding, recommended by a housekeeper Eugenia had known for years, and the shepherds and shearers came and went with the season, privy to nothing beyond the yard itself. It left, by process of the same patient arithmetic she had learned to apply to every other trouble that year, only one name. She confronted him on a wet afternoon in the stable block, where she found him mending a length of harness with more concentration than the task strictly required. "How long have you been carrying word of this house to Mr. Praed?" she asked him, without preamble, and watched the leather strap still entirely in his hands. He did not deny it. She would afterward credit him with that much. He set the harness down slowly, and when he finally looked at her, his face had none of its usual sullen composure left in it at all. "Since before you ever set foot on this land," he said, "there was a debt from my late wife's illness the year before she died. A moneylender in Gloucester, who sold the note on, as such men do, and it found its way eventually into hands connected to the Duke's people. I was told, plainly enough, that the debt could be called in whenever it suited them, and my cottage along with it, unless I was willing to send word now and again of what went on up at the house. I am not a young man, Miss Calloway. I had nowhere else to go, and no one left who would have taken me in if I had." "What have you told them?" Eugenia asked, her voice very level. "Little enough that mattered at first," he said. "The state of the roof, how many men you had hired. What I told myself was harmless. But I sent word of the shearing, and of the coin it brought, and I sent word, God forgive me, of the letter from your father's solicitor that went missing from the hall table, because Praed's man asked me directly whether such a paper existed, and I did not have the nerve to lie to his face." Eugenia stood in the damp straw smell of the stable a long moment, turning over the shape of her own fury, and finding it, to her own surprise, tangled through with something closer to pity. She had learned, in the months since a church door had opened on her ruin, precisely how thin the line could run between a man's honor and a man's survival, and she did not think herself entitled to judge Fell too harshly for having discovered, before she had, exactly where that line sat for a person with nothing left to lose. "I ought to dismiss you within the hour," she said finally. "I would not blame you if you did," he said. "But I will not," she said. "Not because I have forgiven you, Mr. Fell. I have not yet, and perhaps not for some while. But you are the only man on this land who has been here longer than I have, and I would rather know exactly what you have told them and watch you carefully from this day forward than send you off to starve and have prayed simply find some other frightened soul to take your place, one I would have no notion of watching at all." He looked at her for a long moment, something moving behind his eyes that she could not entirely name, and then he said, low and rough, that he would sooner cut off his own hand than carry another word to Gloucester about this house, whatever it cost him. And Eugenia found, against every sensible instinct she possessed, that she believed him. She did not tell Hargrove of it when he next called, though she came close, twice, before deciding against it. It was, she told herself, a matter for her own household to settle, and she had settled it as best she judged the circumstances allowed. But she found herself watching Fell rather differently in the weeks that followed, not with suspicion exactly, but with the wary, attentive regard one gives a wound that has been stitched closed, but not yet fully healed, uncertain whether it will hold under the next real strain that tests it. The warning, when it finally came, arrived not from Fell, but from Hargrove, less than a fortnight later, in the form of a short, uncharacteristically hurried letter that reached Hartcombe Grange by special messenger rather than the ordinary post. The Stroudwater Navigation Company, he wrote, had that week announced a sudden and considerable increase in tolls charged upon wool and finished cloth carried along any stretch of the canal between Walbridge and the Severn, an increase that applied, so far as he could discover from 3 separate sources within the company's own offices, to no other class of cargo whatsoever. He had made inquiries, discreetly, into who exactly had lately acquired a controlling weight of influence among the company's proprietors, and the answer, though not yet a matter of public record, had come back to him from a clerk he trusted with a name attached to it that neither of them, he wrote, would find in the least surprising. Eugenia read the letter standing in the small room off the library, where she had read her father's final letter from London not 3 weeks before, and felt the same cold settle into her stomach that she had felt the day Suki first mentioned a stranger at the Crossroads Inn. She rode down to Stroud herself the following morning, leaving Fell to manage the estate and taking only Suki for company, and found Hargrove in the small windowed room built into the rafters above his mill floor. A stack of shipping manifests spread across the table before him, and an expression on his face that told her, before he said a single word, that the matter was considerably worse than his letter had allowed. "It is not merely wool," he said, without preamble, once she had shut the door behind her against the noise of the looms. "Any cargo the company classes as cloth or raw fleece is affected. Coal, stone, all of it moves at the old rate. Only wool and cloth have been singled out, which tells you plainly enough that this was never about the company's own finances at all." "How much of an increase?" Eugenia asked. "Enough that I cannot ship a single bale to Bristol or beyond without losing money on the carriage alone," he said. "I have raw fleece enough in my storerooms to keep the looms running perhaps 6 weeks longer. After that I will have no choice but to slow production, and every family in this valley, whose wages depend upon my mill, will feel it within the month." Eugenia sat with that a long moment, watching the looms clatter on below the glass, indifferent to the trouble gathering above them. "He is not trying to ruin you for its own sake," she said slowly. "He is trying to starve you out so that you sever your contract with me and leave me with wool nobody in this county will dare to buy." "That was my own conclusion," Hargrove said. "I have no intention of obliging him." "Nor have I any intention of asking you to try," Eugenia said. "But we will need, between us, a rather better answer than defiance alone, before those 6 weeks run out." They sat with that a long while, the noise of the looms filling the silence between them, before Hargrove said slowly, as though testing the idea even as he spoke it, that there might yet be a way to move goods along the water without troubling the company's own toll gates. At all, if a landowner along the route happened to possess some old forgotten right of transit that had never been formally surrendered. Eugenia felt something click into place in her mind, with the particular satisfaction of a fact she had filed away, without knowing why suddenly proving its worth. "There is a wharf at Hartcombe," she said. "My grandfather's, from before the family's fortunes turned. Fell tells me the transit right was never surrendered." Hargrove looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face, tired as it was, warmed considerably. "Then perhaps," he said, We are not quite so cornered as I believed an hour ago. I would not go so far as that yet, Eugenia said. An old right on paper is not the same thing as a working landing, Mr. Hargrove, and I have learned this year precisely how much labor lies between the two. But it is at least a door where I had thought there was only a wall. She rode back up the valley toward Hartcombe Grange that afternoon, with the light going long in gold across the water meadows, her mind already turning over what state the old stone landing might be in, and whether a boat of any real size could be brought up to it at all. And she found that the fear which had settled into her stomach that morning had not left her exactly, but had at least been joined by something more useful, the particular, clear-headed calculation she had learned, that year, to bring to bear on every trouble that presented itself. She had thought, foolishly perhaps, that the worst of it had already found her, in a church and in a stable and in a letter from Calais. She understood now, riding back up the valley toward Hartcombe Grange with the afternoon light going long and gold across the water meadows, that she had been wrong, and that whatever quiet, patient campaign had been set in motion the previous September was only now, with the wool finally sold and the coin finally counted, beginning in earnest. She wrote to Tukes that same evening, setting down the whole of the toll increase and Hargrove's suspicions as to its cause, and his reply reached her within the week, shorter and graver than his letters generally ran. He confirmed what Hargrove had already half suspected, that a controlling weight of shares in the Stroudwater Navigation Company had changed hands that spring through an intermediary, whose name, once traced back through two further intermediaries, led precisely where she had feared it would. He added in a final paragraph that she read a great many times over before she finally set the letter aside, that he had begun, at her request some months before, to look further into the settlement made at the time of her parents' marriage, and that what he had found there was, in his own words, considerably more substantial than either of them had first supposed, though he did not consider a letter a safe enough vessel to explain it properly, and asked instead that she come to Gloucester herself as soon as her affairs allowed. Eugenia folded that letter away with the others. In the growing stack she now kept locked in the same drawer as her mother's ledger, and stood a long while at the window of the small room off the library, watching the last of the light drain out of the valley. Whatever her mother had left her, beyond a manor and a private book of figures, had waited quietly for 23 years to matter. She found she was no longer entirely surprised that it should choose, of all possible seasons, this one to finally make itself known. Eugenia rode to Gloucester the following week, leaving Fell in charge of the estate and taking Sukey with her for the 2 nights the journey required. She had never before had occasion to visit the city properly, and found it, on the June morning they finally arrived, a solid businesslike place of gray stone and busy quays, the cathedral tower rising above the rooftops with a weight of centuries that made her own small troubles feel for a moment agreeably insignificant, before the thought of exactly why she had come reasserted itself, and the feeling passed. She found Ambrose Tukes waiting for her in the cramped book-lined office above his clerk's rooms, with an expression on his face that told her, before he had said a single word of greeting, that whatever he had found was not the sort of news a man delivered lightly. "Your mother," he said, once she was seated and the door properly closed, was rather more careful with her own affairs than I believe your father ever gave her credit for. At the time of their marriage, some 30 years ago now, her own father insisted upon a proper settlement, drawn up before the wedding, and witnessed by 2 independent parties, establishing a sum and a small parcel of land, Hartcombe among it, as her separate estate, held in trust for her own use, and, after her death for any daughter of the marriage, entirely apart from whatever your father might otherwise have controlled as her husband. "I know Hartcombe was left to me," Eugenia said. "I have never properly understood why it sat outside my father's reach when everything else did not." "Because it was never his to reach," Tukes said. "Your mother's father named 2 trustees to hold and administer the property on her behalf, and after her, on yours, precisely so that no husband, present or future, could claim it merely by right of marriage. I am one of those trustees still living. The other, your mother's own brother, died some years ago without the office passing to anyone else, which leaves the whole of the administration, as a practical matter, in my hands alone, subject always to the accounts being properly kept and open to inspection should any party with a legitimate interest ever wish to examine them. He rose and drew from a locked drawer in his own desk a slim bundle of papers, considerably older and more yellowed than the deed Praed had drafted, and laid it before her. She recognized her mother's maiden name upon the first page, and beneath it a list of witnesses she did not know, and a description of Hartcombe Grange, and a modest sum of consolidated funds, all of it set down in the careful, old-fashioned hand of some solicitor long since dead. "It is not a large fortune, Eugenia," Tuke said, watching her read. "It was never meant to make you rich. It was meant, so far as I understand your grandfather's intentions, to ensure that whatever else befell you, you would never be entirely without a roof that was legally, unquestionably your own." "It very nearly was not," Eugenia said quietly. "If I had married Julian as planned." "Had you married him," Tuke said, "this settlement would have continued to protect the property from your husband's creditors, as it was designed to do. It would not, I am sorry to say, have protected you from your husband himself, not in any respect the law presently recognizes. A wife's legal person is, in the eyes of the courts, very largely absorbed into her husband's the moment the vows are spoken. It is one of the few mercies in this whole unhappy business that you never reached that particular altar step." Eugenia sat with that a long moment, turning the shape of it over. "And this is why father could not touch it," she said slowly, "however deep his debts ran." "Precisely so," Tuke said. "It is also, I believe, why the deed you found on the night of your wedding troubles me rather more than it did when I first read it. A settlement of this kind is proof, should proof ever be required, that a woman may hold property and manage her own affairs entirely independent of any man's goodwill, provided the law recognizes her as capable of doing so. I begin to suspect, Eugenia, that this is exactly the point upon which the whole of Calderbrook's scheme, whatever its final shape proves to be, is likely to turn." She asked him then to explain himself more fully, and he did, laying out for her, in the careful, methodical manner she remembered from her childhood, precisely what the phrase "in the event of incapacity" had troubled him from the very first reading. "A woman of full age and sound mind," he explained, "unmarried, held property and made contracts very nearly as freely under the law as any man of her station, a freedom she would in fact have lost, not gained, had she married Calderbrook as planned, since marriage would have folded whatever she owned into her husband's control the moment the vows were spoken. The single circumstance under which that freedom could be stripped from her, regardless of her marital state, was a formal finding, by a court, that she was not of sound mind to manage her own affairs, a finding which would place her, and everything she held, under the control of whichever guardian the court saw fit to appoint." "And who," Eugenia asked, her voice gone quiet, "would a court most naturally appoint as guardian to an unmarried woman found incapable, if not her own father?" Tukes did not answer at once. When he did, his voice had none of its usual careful neutrality left in it. "Precisely so," he said, "and your father, Eugenia, presently owes his freedom from a debtor's jail entirely to the patience of men who report, in the end, to the Duke of Calderbrook." She asked him then how such a finding was actually reached, whether it required more than the say-so of an interested party, and he explained, with the same patient thoroughness he had once used, to walk her through her multiplication tables as a girl, that the law provided for a formal inquiry, a writ directed to the Lord Chancellor himself, empowering a commission to examine the person in question before a jury drawn from the county, with witnesses called and evidence weighed openly. The whole proceeding generally held in some public room, large enough to accommodate whoever chose to attend and observe it. "It is not," he said, "a private or a hidden thing, whatever else it is. That, at least, works somewhat in your favor. A jury of ordinary men, watching a woman conduct herself with plain good sense before their own eyes, is not always so easily persuaded by paper alone as an interested petitioner might hope. Then the accounts I keep, and the contracts I have signed, and the men who have watched me manage this land for a year," Eugenia said slowly, "are not merely comforts. They are evidence I may one day have to present myself before strangers in order to keep my own mind recognized as my own." "I am afraid that is precisely what I mean." "Yes," Tuke said. The shape of it settled over her slowly. In the quiet of that book-lined office, the way frost settles over a window pane, spreading from some first small point of contact until the whole surface is obscured. The wedding, the mistress paraded down the aisle before 300 witnesses, the word hysterical, spoken loudly enough to carry to the furthest pew, the deed signed within the same season, broad enough in its language to touch upon her future incapacity, though she had given no one then any cause whatsoever to imagine such a finding likely. None of it had been cruelty for its own sake, or wounded pride, or even simple greed for her dowry. It had been the opening move of a considerably longer game, played by a man patient enough to spend a year building the public record of a young woman's supposed instability before he ever needed to make use of it, confident that a father drowning in debt could be relied upon, when the moment finally came, to sign whatever paper was placed in front of him. She thought, with a clarity that felt almost physical, of the thin, precise man she had noticed near the front of St. George's, sitting with his leather case already prepared, watching the empty aisle with the patient attention of a man expecting a delivery he was quite certain would arrive. Praed had not come to witness a wedding at all. He had come to witness the first entry in a record Julian intended, all along, to build. "I do not think," Tuke said gently, watching her face, "that he expected you to run to Gloucestershire and make yourself a success of sheep and wool. I think he expected you to remain in London, humiliated and dependent, exactly the sort of fragile, friendless young woman a court might easily be persuaded was not entirely in command of herself. Your independence has cost him a year of patience he did not plan to spend. I do not believe, however, that it has changed his final intention in the slightest." "Then what protection does the settlement actually offer me?" Eugenia asked, "if a court may still find me incapable, regardless of how soundly I have managed my own affairs?" "None whatsoever on its own," Tukes admitted. "A finding of incapacity is a finding of incapacity, whatever property sits behind it. But the settlement means that should such a finding ever be sought, the honest record of how that property has actually been managed, by whom, and to what effect, becomes evidence since any court must weigh, and weigh carefully, before it accepts the word of an interested party over the plain testimony of the accounts themselves. Keep your ledgers, Eugenia. Keep every letter, every contract, every scrap of paper that shows your own hand at work in this. I begin to fear you will have greater need of them than either of us would wish." She left Gloucester 2 days later with a copy of the settlement's essential terms, folded carefully into the same drawer as her mother's ledger, and a dread settled low in her chest that not even the fine spring weather along the road home could entirely dispel. She found herself, on the ride back, thinking a great deal about her mother, a woman she remembered chiefly as a quiet, watchful presence at the edges of her own childhood, dead before Eugenia was old enough to properly know her, beyond the fact of her absence afterward. She had always assumed, on the rare occasions she thought of it at all, that her mother's early death had left her with nothing beyond a manner she barely understood, and a habit of keeping careful figures she had inherited without knowing its source. She understood now that her mother had, in fact, left her something considerably more deliberate than that, a settlement drawn up before her own marriage, with precisely this sort of danger in mind, as though some part of her had always suspected that a daughter of hers might one day need proof, held safely apart from any husband's reach, that she was capable of standing entirely on her own. It was, Eugenia thought, riding through the soft green evening with Suki silent beside her, the first inheritance she had ever received that felt less like a burden and more like an instruction. The newspapers that reached the valley that week were full of little else besides the crisis, presently convulsing the government in London, the young queen having refused, by every account, to part with certain of her own household attendants, merely to satisfy the incoming ministry's demand for a change of political color among them, a refusal that had brought the whole business of forming a new administration to a standstill for above a fortnight. Eugenia read the accounts with rather more interest than she would have thought herself capable of a year before, not for their own sake, but because Tukes had mentioned, almost in passing during her visit, that Calderbrook was known to be seeking some appointment within the Reformed Ministry's gift, a position that required, above all else, a reputation entirely free of scandal or legal entanglement. It is a small enough world, London, Tukes had said, folding his hands upon the desk between them. A duke who cannot manage his own domestic affairs, whose former betrothed is presently the subject of a contested lunacy petition, however that petition is finally resolved, becomes a considerably less attractive name to place before a minister already nervous about his own government's stability. Calderbrook cannot afford the matter to drag on unresolved through a season when every appointment in the gift of the crown is being weighed twice over for any hint of scandal attached to it. He needs this settled, and settled quietly, before the present confusion in London resolves itself, one way or another, Tukes had said. A man cannot be recommended for a place at court while a commission of lunacy hangs unresolved over the woman he was once engaged to marry, whatever the outcome. I think, Eugenia, that whatever move he intends to make it soon. She asked him, before she left Gloucester, whether there was any way to prevent such a petition from being brought at all, rather than merely preparing to answer it once it arrived. And Tukes admitted, with evident reluctance, that there was very little a person in her position could do beforehand, beyond exactly what she had already been doing, keeping her affairs plainly and honestly ordered, since the law permitted almost anyone with a colorable interest to bring such a petition, and left the burden of disproving it entirely upon the person accused. It is not a fair arrangement, he said. I have watched it used, across 30 years of practice, against widows whose only offense was inconvenient wealth, and against daughters whose only offense was refusing an arranged match. The law was not written with women's independence in mind, Eugenia, and I would be lying to you if I pretended otherwise. It was written, so far as I can tell, chiefly to protect property from falling into careless hands, and it assumes, more often than it ought, that a woman's hands are careless simply by virtue of being a woman's. Then I shall simply have to be considerably less careless than the law expects of me, Eugenia said. Tukes permitted himself at that, something close to a genuine smile. I begin to think, he said, that you already are. She wrote to Hargrove of what she had learned. In guarded terms, she trusted no interested party to make full sense of should the letter go astray, and he rode up from Stroud within 2 days of receiving it, his face set in an expression grimmer than she had yet seen him wear. If he means to move against you directly, he said, once she had laid the whole of it before him in the small room off the library, then the wharf and the wool, and every penny either of us has earned this year mean nothing beside it. Let the company keep its tolls. Let the mill slow its looms if it comes to that. None of it signifies if you are taken from this house. I have no intention of being taken from this house, Eugenia said, with rather more certainty than she entirely felt. He looked at her a long moment, and something in his weathered face, usually so carefully guarded, cracked open into an expression she recognized, with a small shock, as fear, not for himself. I did not come to Gloucestershire looking for a fight of this size, he said quietly. I came looking for a fair price on good wool. I find I have got rather more invested in the outcome than either of us bargained for that 1st November. I did not ask you to become invested, Eugenia said, though not unkindly. No, he agreed. You did not. I managed that entirely on my own, and I find I cannot honestly say I regret it, whatever it costs either of us before this is finished. Eugenia found she had no ready answer to that, and so she said nothing at all, and let the silence between them carry whatever her own carefully guarded heart was not yet prepared to say aloud. He stayed longer than the business strictly required that evening, discussing with her, in careful practical terms, exactly what might be done to strengthen the wharf, if the toll dispute forced them to rely upon it sooner than either had planned. He suggested, turning the matter over aloud, that a second smaller boat kept always ready at the Hartcombe landing might allow them to move at least some portion of any future clip without ever troubling the company's own toll gates, provided the old stonework could bear the weight of regular loading, a question neither of them could properly answer without Fell's own assessment of the landing's condition. It would not solve the difficulty entirely, Hargrove admitted. A single small boat cannot carry what my carts presently move in a week. But it would mean Calderbrook could not simply starve us both by raising a toll, since some portion of the trade would always remain beyond his reach, however small. Then let us see what Fell makes of the old stonework, before we trouble ourselves further, Eugenia said, and found, saying it, a small, steadying comfort in having at least one practical task to set against the larger dread that had not properly left her since Gloucester. It was well past dark before he finally rode back down towards Stroud, leaving her standing at the window of the small room off the library, watching his horse disappear down the drive, with a feeling in her chest she recognized, reluctantly, as something rather closer to hope than the circumstances strictly warranted. Fell brought word to the house 3 evenings later, arriving at the kitchen door well after dark with mud to his knees, and a look on his face she had not seen since the afternoon in the stable block. He had walked, he said, the whole way from the Crossroads Inn rather than risk being seen riding in haste, because the same stranger who had once carried word to Praed on his behalf had been drinking there that evening, careless with his tongue after too much ale, and had let slip to another traveler that a writ was presently being drawn in Gloucester, and that the men who would come to serve it meant to arrive within the week. I do not know if I am believed by anyone in that house any longer, Fell said, his voice rough with something that might have been shame, or might have been simple exhaustion, but I could not let this pass without carrying it to you myself, whatever it costs me to be seen doing it. I believe you, Mr. Fell, Eugenia said, and found, saying it, that she meant it entirely. Did he say anything more, she asked, whether it concerns me directly, or the toll dispute, or something else besides? He said only the word writ, and your name, and something about your father, Fell said. I did not dare press him further without giving myself away. But I have carried enough of Praed's business past this house over the last year to know the shape of a thing that is meant to move quickly once it moves at all, and this had that shape to it. Eugenia thanked him and meant it, and sent Suki at once with a note to Hargrove, and stood a long while afterward at the window of the small room off the library, watching the dark shape of the wharf road disappear into the night, and understood, with the same cold, clear-headed calculation she had learned to bring to every trouble that year, that whatever was coming would not wait a great deal longer to arrive. She spent the following 2 days in a state of watchful, methodical preparation that she recognized, distantly, as the same instinct that had carried her through the worst of the previous winter, the refusal to sit idle simply because the shape of the danger was not yet fully known. She copied out, in her own careful hand, every entry from the estate ledger since her arrival, and sealed the copy into the same iron-bound strong-box in the library that already held her mother's original ledger and letters, intending it as a single safe record should anything happen to the loose papers scattered elsewhere about the house. She wrote to Tukes himself, setting down Fell's warning in full and asking him to hold himself ready to come to her the moment she sent word. She walked the whole perimeter of the house with Fell one gray afternoon, noting which doors locked properly and which did not, an exercise that felt, even as she performed it, both entirely sensible and faintly absurd, as though she were fortifying a castle against an enemy she could not yet see clearly enough to name. Fell, for his part, took to sleeping in the stable rather than his own cottage, a change he explained only by saying that a man who had once carried word out of this house had better ways now of proving he meant to carry nothing further out of it without her leave, and Eugenia understood, watching him settle a straw mattress into the empty stall beside the horses, that this was as close as he was ever likely to come to apologizing in words for the whole of what he had already confessed to her in the stable block that wet spring afternoon. Hargrove came the evening of the 2nd day, later than his usual visits, having ridden straight from the mill without troubling to change out of his working clothes, and found her in the library going through the last of the copied ledgers by candlelight. He did not comment on the lateness of the hour, nor on the faint absurdity of a woman fortifying a half-ruined manor against a threat that had not yet properly announced itself. He only sat with her a while in the quiet of that room, the shelves of soft, damp-spined books rising on 3 sides around them, and told her, when she finally set down her pen, that whatever came, he did not intend to be far away when it did. I would rather you were safely at your mill, Eugenia said, than caught up in whatever this becomes. I have spent 12 years watching that family take what it wanted from people who could not fight back, Hargrove said. I find I have very little interest in being safely elsewhere, while it happens again to someone I have come to care for, a great deal more than good business sense would generally recommend. Eugenia looked at him a long moment in the candlelight and found she had, for once, nothing clever or guarded left to say in reply, and so she said nothing at all, and let him sit with her a while longer in the quiet, both of them watching the small, steady flame between them, as though it might, if they looked at it long enough, tell them something useful about what the coming days intended to bring. It came in the end on the third night, well past midnight, while the house lay dark, and Hargrove sat still awake in a chair he had dragged into the small room off the library, refusing, despite her protests, to ride back to Stroud until he was satisfied the immediate danger had passed. The 3 days since Fell's warning had passed in a strange, suspended quiet, the ordinary business of the estate continuing much as it always had, wages paid, letters written. The second boat Hargrove had proposed for the wharf still only half discussed, while beneath all of it ran a current of watchfulness that none of them named aloud, but all of them plainly felt. Eugenia had taken to checking, each night before retiring, that the library door stood properly latched, and the strongbox sat exactly where it always did upon its usual shelf, a precaution that had felt, in the daylight hours, faintly absurd, and would prove, before the night was out, to have been nowhere near cautious enough. Eugenia had not meant to sleep at all that night, and had lain fully dressed atop her covers for what felt like hours, listening to the ordinary creak and settle of the old house, before exhaustion finally claimed her sometime after midnight. She woke to the smell of it first, a sharpness under the ordinary damp and wood smoke of the house that her body recognized as wrong before her mind had properly caught up, and lay for one confused, disoriented moment, believing herself still within some half-formed dream, before the second breath told her, with a clarity that drove every other thought from her head at once, that the smell was real, and close, and growing. Fire, she heard Hargrove shout, somewhere below her, and then the sound of him already moving, fast and heavy, toward the source of it, and she was out of her bed and down the corridor before she had even properly registered rising. She came down the stairs into a scene that would return to her, for the rest of her life, in fragments more than any coherent whole. Smoke, thick and choking, rolling along the library ceiling in a way that made her eyes stream and her throat close before she was even properly through the door. The oak shelving, dry as tinder after a decade of neglect, catching with a speed that seemed almost obscene, flame climbing shelf to shelf faster than seemed possible for wood so old and damp beneath its surface, as though it had been helped along its way by something considerably more purposeful than mere accident. A broken window at the garden side of the room, glass scattered inward across the floor in a spray that told its own story plainly enough to anyone who paused to look. The clear mark of where something had been thrown through it to start the blaze, rather than any accident of a dropped candle or an untended grate. Fell was already there, beating at the nearest flames with a wet sack and shouting for Suki to bring more water, his face lit orange in the firelight. And it was Fell, she would understand only later, who had woken at the first smell of smoke and roused the household before the fire could take hold of anything beyond the one room. The ledgers, Eugenia said, or thought she said, her voice lost somewhere in the roar and crackle of the burning shelves. The strongbox, my mother's papers. She did not see Hargrove move toward the far side of the room, where the iron-bound strongbox sat upon its usual shelf beneath the worst of the smoke, until she heard him cry out, a short, terrible sound that cut through the noise of the fire itself, and turned to see him staggering backward, with the box clutched against his chest, his right hand and forearm wrapped in flame that had caught the sleeve of his coat as he reached through a wall of burning shelving to drag the box free. Fell was on him in an instant, smothering the flame with the same wet sack he had been using against the shelves, and Eugenia was there a moment after, tearing at the ruined, smoking cloth of his sleeve with her bare hands, heedless of her own skin, until the fire on him was properly out, and he sank, all at once to his knees on the library floor, the strong box still clutched against him, his face gone the color of old paper. It is done, he managed, through what she understood, even in the chaos of the moment, must be considerable pain. "The box is safe. Get it away from the fire." She took it from him with hands that would not entirely stop shaking, and it was only once the box was safely out in the hall, and Suki and the boy from the stable were finally getting the last of the flames under control, with buckets hauled from the yard well, that she was able to look properly at what the fire had cost him. The skin of his right hand and lower arm had blistered and blackened in a pattern that made her stomach turn even to look at directly. The fingers already curling inward with a stiffness that had nothing to do with pain alone. And something in the set of his jaw, watching her look at it, told her, before any surgeon ever would, that whatever healed of that hand in the weeks to come, it would not heal whole. She thought, with a clarity that felt almost cruel in the middle of so much smoke and noise, of the small windowed room above his mill floor, of hands she had once watched thread and test a length of finished wool between his fingers with the easy, practiced skill of a man who had spent his whole working life at exactly that task, and understood, kneeling on the cold stone beside him, that whatever else the night had taken from either of them, it had taken that from him permanently, and would go on taking it, in some small daily fashion, for the whole of whatever life remained to him afterward. "I have sent for the surgeon in the village," Fell said, appearing at her shoulder, his own face streaked black with smoke, his voice raw from shouting orders through the worst of it. "He will be here within the hour. I have sent the stable boy for him at a gallop." "Thank you, Fell," Eugenia said, and found, even in the wreck of that terrible night, that she meant the thanks entirely, and that whatever debt of trust he had once broken, he had spent this single hour repaying it in full. Eugenia knelt beside Hargrove on the cold stone of the hall floor, the strong box between them, and found she could not, for the moment, speak at all. He looked at her with an expression that held no self-pity in it whatsoever, only a kind of grim, exhausted satisfaction. "The papers are safe," he said again, as though this were the only fact in the room that mattered. "Whatever else this costs, Eugenia, the papers are safe." The surgeon came, and did what could be done, which was not, by his own honest admission, a great deal beyond cleaning the burn and binding it, and telling them plainly that the hand would heal scarred, and that Hargrove ought not expect the full use of his fingers again, not for fine work, not for the close, careful handling of cloth and thread that had been the whole of his working life since he was a boy. He gave Hargrove a tincture for the pain, which Hargrove accepted, and then, once the surgeon's back was turned, quietly set aside untouched, saying only that he wished to keep his head clear for whatever the remainder of the night still had in store for them, a statement that proved, within the hour, considerably more prophetic than any of them could then have known. Suki, meanwhile, moved through the smoke-stained hall with a steadiness that surprised even Eugenia, boiling water and tearing clean linen into strips for the surgeon's use, without once needing to be asked twice, and it occurred to Eugenia, watching her, that the frightened girl, who had unlaced her out of a ruined wedding gown 10 months before, had grown, over the course of that same hard year, into a woman entirely capable of meeting a crisis without flinching from it, a transformation she had been too occupied with her own troubles to properly notice until this single terrible night forced it into plain view. Hargrove received the surgeon's verdict with the same set, exhausted stillness he had shown throughout, and said only that a mill could be run with a mind and a voice quite as well as with a hand, and that he did not intend to let a burn decide otherwise. Eugenia, watching him say it, understood that he did not fully believe his own words even as he spoke them, and loved him a little for saying them regardless, a realization that arrived with such quiet, unremarkable simplicity, in the middle of so much smoke and grief, that she did not have time to properly examine it before the second blow of that night arrived, to drive every other feeling from the room completely. It was not yet dawn, the house still smelling of smoke and wet ash, the library itself a ruin of blackened shelving and sodden, scorched paper, when that second blow finally came. Eugenia heard the horses first, more than one, coming up the drive at a pace that suggested men in no mood to wait for a civil hour, and she was standing in the open front doorway, still in her night clothes with a shawl thrown over them, soot on her hands and the strong box held against her chest, when 3 riders drew up before the house, one of them a stranger she did not recognize. dressed plainly but with an unmistakable air of official business about him, a folded paper held in one gloved hand. "I am here on the authority of the Court of Chancery," the stranger said, dismounting, his manner formal and entirely without apology. "I act for the Lord Chancellor in the execution of this writ. Are you Eugenia Calloway, presently residing at this address?" "I am," Eugenia said, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect, given the state of the hall behind her. "Then I must ask you to accompany me to Gloucester," the officer said, unfolding the paper. "A writ de lunatico inquirendo has been issued upon petition, directing that an inquiry be held into the state of your mind, and pending that inquiry, that you be placed under suitable supervision away from this property." Upon whose petition Eugenia asked, though she already knew the shape of the answer before it came. "Upon the petition of your father, Edward Calloway, Baron Raxford," the officer said, consulting the paper, "supported by an instrument of consent, executed some 14 months previously, and presently held by the petitioner's solicitor, a Mr. Edmund Praed." Eugenia felt the ground shift very slightly beneath her, though she did not move and did not let her face show anything beyond the composure she had spent a year teaching herself to wear like armor. "My father is presently in Calais," she said. "He has not set foot in England in above 2 months. He cannot have petitioned this court for anything at all, sir, whatever paper Mr. Praed has placed before you. That is a matter for the commission to examine. In due course," the officer said, not unkindly, but with the flat, immovable patience of a man who had delivered a great many unwelcome papers in his time and did not intend to be argued out of his duty by the recipient of one. "My instructions are to execute the writ as it stands before me, Miss Calloway, and to bring you before the commission when it sits, where you will have every opportunity to raise precisely that objection, among whatever others you wish, in front of those with the authority to weigh it. I am not that authority. I am only its instrument." "When does it sit?" Eugenia asked. "Within the month," the officer said. "Word will be sent to you of the date, once you are settled. I would ask you now to dress and gather what you require. We must reach Gloucester before nightfall, and I have been instructed to allow you a companion for the journey, and for whatever lodging is arranged there, should you wish one. I will need a moment to dress," she said, "and to speak to my household." "You may have that moment," the officer said. "I am not without some sympathy for the hour, madam, whatever my instructions require of me otherwise." She went to Hargrove first, kneeling beside him one final time before Suki came to help her dress, and found she had no words equal to the size of what had happened to either of them in the course of a single night. He looked up at her, his good hand finding hers and gripping it with a strength that belied everything the surgeon had just told them about the other. "The papers are safe," he said again. "Quiet now, only for her. Whatever they do to you in Gloucester, Eugenia, the truth of what you built here is sitting in that box, and I will see it placed in Tukes's hands myself before this day is out, if I have to ride there with this arm strapped to the saddle to manage it." Fell was waiting for her at the foot of the stairs. When she came down dressed, Suki already gathering what few things could be packed in so short a time, and he stood with his cap twisted between his hands in a manner she had never once seen from him in the whole of the year she had known him. "I will keep this house standing until you return," he said. "Whatever else I have failed to do for you, Miss Calloway, I will not fail you in that." "I know you will," Eugenia said, and found, saying it, that the trust she offered him was no longer a wary provisional thing, but something she meant entirely, earned in full over the course of one terrible night. She left Hartcombe Grange an hour later in the gray, smoke-smelling light of a dawn that refused to look like any ordinary morning, riding beside an officer of the Court of Chancery in a carriage that was not her own, toward a city, and a hearing whose outcome she could not, for the first time since a church door had opened on the worst day of her old life, begin to predict, and understood, watching the ruined shape of the house recede behind her, that whatever she had built through a long winter and a longer spring now rested on evidence she might never be permitted to properly present, in the hands of a man whose burned and ruined arm was the price already paid for saving it. Suki came with her as the officer had promised, and they were lodged, upon reaching Gloucester, in a narrow set of rooms above a respectable draper's shop, plainly furnished but not unkind, with a woman set to watch the door who was civil enough in her manner, though she never once let Eugenia forget, by so much as a relaxed moment's inattention, precisely why she was there. Eugenia was permitted to write letters, and to receive them, and to walk twice daily in the small walled garden behind the shop under the woman's watchful eye. And beyond that, her days narrowed, for the first time since the previous September, into something with almost nothing left in it for her own hands to build or mend. She spent the first of those long-watched days simply sitting by the window, turning over every fact of the fire and the writ together, searching for some flaw in the shape of it she might yet exploit, and found by the second day that the exercise brought her nothing beyond a headache and a fresh, grinding fear that circled back always to the same unanswered question. She did not know, sitting in that narrow room above the draper's shop, whether the papers Hargrove had sworn to carry safely to Tukes had actually arrived, whether his ruined arm had managed the journey at all, or whether the single piece of evidence that might yet save her was even now lying somewhere on a Gloucestershire road, lost along with everything else the fire had already taken from them both. At night, when the watching woman had finally retired and Suki lay sleeping in the narrow cot beside her own, Eugenia found she could not close her eyes without seeing, over and over, the way the flame had wrapped itself around Hargrove's arm, and the terrible stillness that had settled over his face in the moment he first understood what it had cost him. She thought of her mother, dead before Eugenia was old enough to properly ask her a single question, and of the settlement drawn up 30 years before with exactly this danger, or one very much like it, apparently already in mind. She thought of her father, somewhere across a gray stretch of water in Calais, and wondered, for the first time without any bitterness left in the wondering, whether he yet knew what had been done in his name, and what he would choose to do about it if he did. She thought, too, of the church at St. George's and the veil she had let fall to the marble floor, and the particular foolish pride she had felt, walking out into the London morning, believing she had already faced the worst that a man like Julian Thorncastle could do to her. She understood now, lying awake in a rented room above a draper's shop with a stranger paid to watch her comings and goings, that the wedding had been nothing more than the opening line of a much longer sentence, one Julian had always intended to finish on his own terms, however long it took him, and she found herself wondering, in the darkest hour of that long sleepless week, whether any amount of ledgers and settlements and sworn letters would prove enough to stop him finishing it now. She'd not sleep that first night in Gloucester, or the second, or very much at all through the long-watched, uncertain week that followed, and it was into precisely that exhaustion, on the 8th morning of her confinement, that a letter finally arrived, bearing a hand she recognized at once, and a seal that told her, before she had even broken it, that whatever news it carried had traveled a very great distance to reach her. The letter was from Tukes, and inside it, folded separately, and sealed again with wax that bore the mark of the British consul at Calais, was a second letter in a hand Eugenia knew as well as her own, unsteady in places where her father's pen had plainly trembled, but unmistakably his. Tukes explained, in his own covering note, that he had written to her father the very week the writ was served, setting out plainly what use was being made of his old signature, and that her father's reply, once it finally crossed the channel, had arrived not as an ordinary letter, but as a formal sworn statement, witnessed and sealed by the consul's own clerk, so that it might carry whatever legal weight the distance between Calais and Gloucester would otherwise have stripped from it. It had cost him, Tukes noted, very nearly the whole of what little money he had left to arrange the swearing properly and to have it carried back to England by a reliable hand rather than trusted to the ordinary post. And Eugenia understood, reading that single practical detail, precisely how much her father had chosen to spend, in every sense the word allowed, on this one final act. I write this before a witness of His Majesty's consulate, so that it may carry whatever weight the law allows a man in my position to offer from so far outside its reach, her father had written. I have this week learned through Mr. Tukes of the use presently being made of a document I signed above a year ago, and I wish it set down plainly and sworn to that I never at any time petitioned any court regarding my daughter's state of mind, that I was never consulted regarding any such petition, and that the paper I signed in the spring of last year concerned only the settlement of certain debts at Mr. Praed's own drafting, with no mention whatsoever that I understood or was ever shown of any future finding upon my daughter's capacity. If my signature has been used to suggest my consent to this proceeding, I state here under oath that it was obtained through deception, and that I do not, and never have, believed my daughter anything other than entirely sound in her mind, considerably more sound, in fact, than her own father has shown himself to be these several years past. I have wronged Eugenia in a great many smaller ways over the course of her life. I will not compound it now by remaining silent while my own name is used to take from her the one thing I have left in my power to protect. Eugenia read the letter through twice, standing at the narrow window of the room above the draper's shop, and found that the tears that finally came, the first she had allowed herself since the night of the fire, were not entirely tears of relief, though relief was certainly part of them. Her father had given her very little, across the whole of her 23 years, that had cost him anything real to give. This, whatever else it did or failed to do before a jury, had plainly cost him something, sitting in a cramped consulate office in a foreign town, admitting in writing and under oath precisely how thoroughly he had failed her. Tukes came to see her himself 2 days later, admitted by the watching woman after a lengthy examination of his credentials, and sat with her in the narrow front room going through, with his usual careful thoroughness, everything that had happened since the fire. Hargrove, he confirmed, had reached his office within a day of leaving Hartcombe Grange, his arm strapped as he had promised it would be, and had delivered the strongbox into Tukes's own hands before permitting himself so much as a moment's rest, refusing even to sit until the matter was properly done. "He is healing," Tukes said, watching her face carefully as he said it. "Slowly, and not, I am told, without a great deal of pain, but the surgeon in Stroud believes the arm itself will serve him well enough in time, even if the hand never fully recovers its former use. He has asked me to tell you that he intends to be in Gloucester himself on the day the commission sits, whatever his own surgeon advises about the wisdom of the journey." "I would rather he stayed and let that arm heal properly," Eugenia said, though she found, saying it, that some part of her was already glad of the promise regardless. "I told him precisely that myself," Tukes said. "He informed me, in terms I will not trouble to repeat exactly, that he had not carried a strongbox out of a burning room merely to sit at home while its contents were argued over by strangers. I do not believe either of us will succeed in changing his mind, my dear, and I confess I have rather stopped trying." Eugenia laid the ledgers she had copied out before the fire upon the table between them, alongside the trust settlement and her father's sworn letter, and spent the better part of that afternoon and the whole of the following day going through, with Tukes, exactly how each piece fitted against the others, what questions she might reasonably expect to be asked, and how she meant to answer every one of them. "You understand," Tukes said gravely, somewhere in the second afternoon of their preparation, "that you will very likely be asked to speak for yourself before the commission, not merely to sit while counsel speaks on your behalf. It is not always done so directly, but I have seen enough of these proceedings to know that a jury weighs nothing so heavily as the plain evidence of a person's own bearing and speech, set against whatever paper an interested party has brought before them." "Then I shall speak for myself," Eugenia said. "I have spent a year learning to answer for my own affairs, Mr. Tukes. I do not intend to stop the one time it matters most." He warned her, too, of what she was likely to hear from the other side of the room before her own turn came, that Praed would almost certainly make much of the scene at St. George's, of her removal to a remote and neglected property, of her decision to oversee shearing and estate business with her own hands rather than through an agent, presenting each fact not as evidence of good sense, but as evidence of a mind that had lost its proper bearings. He counseled her to let none of it move her visibly, however unjust the framing, since watching a woman remain composed under provocation was, in his considerable experience, worth a great deal more than any amount of righteous protest offered in the heat of the moment. "I have had a year of practice remaining composed under provocation, Mr. Tukes," Eugenia said. "I do not think Mr. Praed will find me an easy subject." He looked at her over the top of his spectacles, with something that was, for once, closer to a smile than his usual gravity generally allowed. "No," he said, "I do not imagine he will." The commission sat on the second Tuesday of July, in a large upper room at the King's Head in Gloucester, ordinarily used for assemblies and public dinners, its long windows thrown open against the summer heat and its floor crowded. By the appointed hour, with considerably more of the county's idly curious than Eugenia had expected, drawn, she supposed, by exactly the sort of scandal that had followed her name since the previous September. 2 commissioners sat at a long table at the head of the room, and beside them a jury of 15 men, drawn, as Tukes had explained to her, from among the county's substantial householders, their faces ranging from frank curiosity to a discomfort that suggested at least some of them found the whole business as distasteful as she privately did herself. She wore that morning the same plain gray traveling dress she had worn through the worst of the previous winter's repairs, at Tukes' own suggestion, rather than anything finer Suki had packed for her, and understood, taking her place at the front of that crowded room, exactly why he had counseled it. A woman dressed for a courtroom looked, to a jury of practical men, considerably less trustworthy than a woman dressed for the work she claimed to have actually done. Hargrove arrived only minutes before the commissioners took their seats, his arms still bound, his face pale with what she suspected was as much exhaustion from the journey as pain, and found a place at the very back of the room rather than beside her. A small, deliberate distance, she understood at once, was meant to protect her case rather than support it, since the appearance of an interested suitor, speaking too closely in her ear, might, in the eyes of a suspicious jury, undermine the very independence she had come to prove. Praed opened the case on behalf of the petition, his manner every bit as thin and precise as she remembered it from the front pew of St. George's, laying out for the commissioners and the jury a narrative constructed, she recognized almost at once, from a year's worth of carefully gathered fragments. The scene at the altar presented now as evidence of a violent and hysterical temperament rather than the considered response to a public humiliation it had actually been. Her removal to a remote and derelict property presented as evidence of an unhealthy withdrawal from proper society. Her personal supervision of shearing and estate business presented, with a delicacy of phrasing that made the insult all the plainer, as conduct scarcely becoming a gentlewoman of sound and settled mind. He called, as his principal witness beyond the documents themselves, a Mr. Josiah Fell, described to the commissioners as the steward of Hartcombe Grange, and a man who had known Miss Castleaway's conduct at closest quarters throughout the period in question. Before Fell was called, Praed offered the commissioners a brief, formal statement from Julian himself, read aloud by a clerk since the Duke, Praed explained, wished the commission to understand that he brought no personal grievance to these proceedings, only a proper concern, as a gentleman once connected to the family, for a young woman he believed to be in genuine distress. Eugenia listened to the statement read out in a clerk's flat, uninflected voice and felt a cold, private fury at the sheer polish of the lie, dressed up as concern for the very woman it had spent a year quietly working to destroy, and understood, watching several of the jurors nod along to its careful, reasonable phrasing, exactly how dangerous a well-constructed story could be, even against the plainest of facts. Eugenia watched Fell take his place before the commissioners, his cap once again twisted between his hands, and felt her stomach tighten, not from any fear of what he might say, but from a fierce, protective anger on his behalf at the position Praed had placed him in. "Mr. Fell," Praed began, "you have, I believe, on occasion supplied information regarding Miss Calloway's activities to my own office over the past year." "I have," Fell said, his voice steady in a way she had not entirely expected, "because your man held a debt over my head that would have seen me and my cottage both turned out, and I am not ashamed to say I was frightened enough, at the start, to do as I was told." A murmur went round the room at that, and Praed's composure flickered, just visibly, before he pressed on. And in the course of supplying that information, he said, "Did you ever observe conduct on Miss Calloway's part that struck you as irrational, or unsound, or otherwise consistent with the finding this commission has been asked to consider?" "Never once," Fell said, and his voice, this time carried clearly to every corner of the room. I have watched that young woman rebuild a ruin with her own 2 hands through a winter that would have broken men twice her size. I have watched her keep books more carefully than any steward I have served under, in 40 years of this work, my own included. Whatever your master paid me to report, sir, and whatever fear kept me reporting it, I never once sent word of anything that looked to me like madness, because there was never anything of the kind to send. Praed attempted for some further minutes to press fell towards some more useful admission, but the old man held to his account with a stubbornness that Eugenia, watching from her place beside Tukes, found herself profoundly grateful for, and by the time Praed finally released him from the stand, it was plain, from the expressions upon several of the jurors' faces, that his witness had done his case considerably more harm than good. When her own turn came to speak, Eugenia rose and crossed to stand before the commissioner's table with the same steady, deliberate calm she had once summoned to walk the length of a church aisle before 300 witnesses, and found that the room's attention, rather than unsettling her, settled something instead. The way the weight of a task well understood had always settled her. From the first morning, she had stood in the mud counting fleeces. I do not dispute the facts my father's supposed petition sets out regarding my conduct this past year, she told the commissioners. I dispute entirely that any of it demonstrates unsoundness of mind. I left a man who humiliated me before witnesses because I judged with a clear head that no arrangement built upon my silence in the face of such treatment could ever serve me well. I took up the management of a neglected property because I judged, again with a clear head, that idleness would serve me considerably worse than labor. I have kept these accounts myself, every entry in my own hand, for a full year, and I ask the commissioners and this jury to examine them now, not as the record of a woman losing her reason, but as the record of precisely how a reasoning mind conducts itself when it is finally left to answer for its own affairs. She laid the ledgers before the commissioner's table herself, page after careful page, and called Tukes to the stand, to speak to the settlement her mother had arranged 30 years before, its terms, its trustees, and the plain fact that its administration had never once, in the whole of that year, given him any cause to doubt her competence to manage what had been left to her. Praed rose to question her once the ledgers and the settlement had both been entered before the commissioners, and Eugenia turned to face him with the same steady attention she had once brought to bear upon a jeweler determined to undervalue a bracelet. You would have this commission believe, Miss Calloway, Praed said, that a young woman living alone, with no husband and no father presently in the country to guide her, is entirely fit to conduct business, negotiate contracts, and manage a household without any male oversight whatsoever. I would have this commission believe precisely what my own ledgers already demonstrate, Eugenia said, that I have done exactly that, successfully, for above a year, and that the absence of a husband to guide me has resulted in rather better management of my affairs than the presence of one very nearly cost me. A ripple of something that was not quite laughter went through the gathered onlookers at that, quickly stilled by one of the commissioners, and Praed's mouth tightened before he pressed on. Is it not true, he said, that you were seen, on the very day of the shearing you have described so proudly to this commission, sitting in the mud of your own courtyard, having been knocked from your feet by an animal you were attempting to manage yourself? It is entirely true, Eugenia said. I stood, resumed my count, and finished the day's work. I would ask the commission to consider whether falling in the mud and rising again unassisted is evidence of a disordered mind, or whether it is, rather, precisely the sort of ordinary resilience this county expects of any farmer, male or female, who means to keep his land productive. Praed had no ready answer for that, and after a further exchange that yielded him nothing further of use, he released her from the stand with a curtness that told the room, as plainly as any verdict could, how little ground his questioning had actually gained. Finally, with the room grown very quiet, she read her father's sworn letter aloud in its entirety, her voice steady until the final lines, when it caught, just slightly, on the admission that he did not, and never had, believed his daughter anything other than entirely sound in her mind. She saw Julian, seated near the back of the room beside Praed's empty chair, go very still at those words, his composure, so carefully worn through the whole of the proceeding, finally cracking in front of the same sort of public gathering he had once used, in a church, to try to break her. This document, she said, once the letter was laid before the commissioners, is dated 5 months before my supposed wedding day, and its language, upon which this entire petition rests, was drafted not by my father, who did not fully understand what he signed, but by Mr. Prade himself, on behalf of a man who required, for reasons of his own, a woman he could one day have declared unfit to manage her own affairs, rather than a wife he would actually have to treat as an equal. I ask this jury to consider not merely whether I am sound of mind, gentlemen, but why, precisely, a duke with a fortune of his own should have gone to such trouble, across the better part of 2 years, to prove that I was not. The jury retired for a little under an hour. A length of deliberation, Tukes told her afterward, was remarkably short for a case of such apparent complexity, and Eugenia spent that hour standing at one of the tall, open windows of the King's Head, with Tukes beside her, watching the ordinary traffic of Gloucester's streets below, carts and pedestrians, and a pair of boys chasing a hoop along the cobbles, entirely indifferent to the fact that a stranger's whole future was presently being weighed in the room above their heads. She found the ordinariness of it oddly steadying, a reminder that whatever the jury decided, the world beyond that single crowded room would continue exactly as it always had, and that she had already proven, across a full year of exactly such ordinary continuing, precisely what she was capable of, regardless of any single verdict. They returned to deliver, before the assembled room, a verdict that Eugenia Calloway was, and had at all times during the period in question remained, of sound mind, fully capable of managing her own affairs, and that the petition before them was accordingly dismissed in its entirety. The room erupted into a noise that was not quite applause and not quite outrage, a confused babble of a county's worth of curiosity, finally satisfied one way rather than another, and through the middle of it Eugenia saw Julian rise from his seat and leave the room without a single word to anyone, Prade hurrying after him with an expression that suggested he understood, with a good deal more clarity than his employer presently did, exactly how much this single afternoon had cost them both. She caught, in the brief moment before the crowd closed around him, a last glimpse of Julian's face, stripped for once of every trace of the composed, faintly bored charm he had worn so easily through the whole of their courtship, and found that the sight moved her a great deal, less than she might once have imagined it would. She did not want him ruined for its own sake. She wanted, and had now finally secured, only the plain, unremarkable freedom to go on managing her own life exactly as she had already proven, across a full year of ledgers and shearing and burned midnight letters, that she was entirely capable of doing. She learned the fuller shape of that cost only over the weeks that followed, in letters that reached Hartcombe Grange from Tukes, and once from her Aunt Frances, who wrote in her usual looping hand to report that all of London was presently occupied with nothing else besides the scandal of a duke's failed scheme to have his own former betrothed declared unfit, and that whatever hopes Calderbrook had entertained of an appointment within the new ministry had evidently been quietly, permanently withdrawn, the whole business having reached the ears of men considerably more powerful than any solicitor could manage. A second letter, some weeks later, mentioned in passing, with the same appetite for scandal Eugenia remembered from the notes that had arrived the night of her own wedding, that Miss Odile Marchant had lately been seen boarding a packet for France with a considerable quantity of luggage and no apparent intention of returning, having informed anyone who asked that she found herself entirely uninterested in remaining attached to a man whose name could no longer open a single door worth walking through. Eugenia read both letters standing at the same window in the small room off the library, rebuilt now with plain new shelving Fell had put up himself through the weeks of her confinement, and found that the news moved through her without any particular triumph attached to it, only a quiet, settled sense that a debt long overdue had finally distantly been paid. She wrote once, and only once, to Julian, a short letter she composed, with rather more care than its brevity suggested, informing him that she considered every matter between their two families now entirely and permanently closed, and that she trusted he would find, in whatever remained of his own prospects, sufficient occupation to keep him from troubling either her or her household again. She received no reply, and expected none, and burned her own copy of the letter in the same grate where she had once burned his midnight note the night of her ruined wedding, finding a certain plain satisfaction in the symmetry of it. Hargrove came to Hartcombe Grange the week after her return, his right arm still bound, and considerably thinner in the hand than it had once been, the scarring visible even at a distance where his sleeve fell back from the wrist. He found her in the courtyard, going over the summer's accounts with Fell, and waited, without impatience, until the business of the morning was properly finished before he asked whether she might walk with him up toward the high pasture, where the second growth of grass was coming in green, over ground that had, the year before, been nothing but rough moorland waiting to be reclaimed. They walked without speaking for a good while, the valley spread out below them in the same gold afternoon light that had once caught the coin in her apron pocket after the shearing, and it was Hargrove who finally broke the silence, his voice quieter than his usual bluntness generally allowed. "I did not ask you, that first November, whether you wished to be courted," he said. "I told myself I had come only for the wool, and for whatever old grievance of my own I still owed your duke, and I let myself believe that for rather longer than was honest of me. I find I cannot go on pretending it any further. Whatever this arm is worth now, Eugenia, I would still give the whole of it again, twice over, for the chance to stand here and ask you properly." "Then ask me properly," Eugenia said, and found her own voice was not nearly so steady as she generally kept it. He turned to face her fully, his ruined hand held a little awkwardly against his side, the good one reaching instead to take hers. "I am not a duke," he said. "I cannot offer you a title or a fortune to match what you gave up walking down that aisle. I can offer you a mill that will still be standing in 40 years, and a man who has watched you build something out of nothing with your own 2 hands, and who would rather spend the rest of his life beside a woman who drives a harder bargain than any factor in this valley, than beside any lady who never learned to drive one at all." "I did not come to Gloucestershire looking to be rescued, Nathaniel," Eugenia said. "I do not need rescuing now." "I know it," he said. "I am not asking to rescue you. I am asking to stand beside you, while you go on doing precisely what you have already proven, this whole year through, that you were always entirely capable of doing yourself." She looked at him a long moment in the gold evening light, at the scarred hand that had reached into a burning room for her sake before either of them had ever spoken a word of love aloud, and found that whatever answer she gave him now would be entirely her own, chosen freely, owed to no contract and no desperate arithmetic of capital and dignity, and she found, turning the whole of that thought over exactly once, that she already knew what it was. "Yes," she said, "ask me properly, and I will answer you properly, every single time, for as long as you care to keep asking." They were married that October quietly, in the same small village church where Fell's own late wife lay buried, with Sukey and Tukes and a handful of Hargrove's mill workers standing as witnesses, and no solicitor anywhere in sight, with a leather case already prepared for papers neither of them had any further need of. Eugenia wore, for the second time in her life, a gown made for a wedding, this one plain wool dyed a deep quiet blue rather than ivory silk, sewn by Sukey's own hand over the course of a single careful fortnight, and found, standing before the small altar with Nathaniel's scarred hand resting in her own, that she felt none of the rigid, corseted dread that had once held her spine so straight before a very different altar in a very different church. Fell gave her away, having asked, with a gruffness that did not entirely disguise how much the asking cost him, whether she would permit an old steward the honor, since her own father remained across the water, and she had by then come to think of very few men in England as family in any sense that mattered beyond the accident of blood. There was no archbishop that day, only the plain, kindly curate of the village church, and no crowd of 300 fashionable witnesses, holding their breath to see what scandal the morning might bring, only a handful of people who had each, in their own way, earned a place in the small chapel by staying, when staying had cost them something real. Nathaniel spoke his vows in the same blunt, unadorned voice he had once used to argue her down from 9 pence a pound to 8.5, and Eugenia found that she trusted the plainness of it a great deal more than she had ever trusted the practiced eloquence of the man who had once promised, in a church very much grander than this one, to make her the envy of every woman in England. Hartcombe Grange stood by the following spring, roofed properly at last from end to end, its library shelved anew and its ledgers, kept now in two careful hands rather than one, showing a profit that would have made her grandfather, whatever else he might have thought of the man who helped her earn it, entirely satisfied. Eugenia stood some months later on the same high pasture where Hargrove had once asked her properly, watching the valley spread gold and green below her, the smoke of his mill rising steady in the distance, and the dark ribbon of the canal carrying its cargo, unhindered now toward the sea, and understood that she had not, in the end, escaped the wreck of that September morning by finding another man willing to shelter her from it. She had escaped it by learning, one blistered, muddy ledger filled month at a time, precisely how much of her own life she had always been capable of building with nothing beyond her own two hands, and by finding, quite by accident, a man patient enough to stand beside her while she did it, asking nothing of her that she had not already proven, entirely on her own, that she was fully capable of giving. Nathaniel came to find her there, as he generally did toward the end of a working day, his scarred hand resting lightly against the small of her back rather than gripping it. The two of them standing together in a silence that had nothing anxious left in it at all, and Eugenia thought, watching the last of the light go long and gold across land that was, in every sense the law now recognized, entirely and unquestionably her own, that she had walked out of one church a year before believing herself ruined, with nothing left to her name but the anger in her own chest, and a manner nobody wanted. She understood now that what she had actually walked into, however little either of them could have named it that gray September morning, was simply the rest of her own life, arriving considerably earlier and considerably harder than most women were ever asked to meet it, and asking of her, in the end, nothing more than the plain, steady work of answering for herself. She found, standing there with her husband's hand warm against her back, and the valley spread gold beneath them both, that she had never once regretted meeting it.